like a little known story. Something I always think is surprisingly unknown is, the episode in 1967 where they all decided to buy a Greek island together
Yeah,
and move in, and
yeah,
and that they actually did it. They actually bought an island from Greece, which is completely insane. And they bought a Greek island and they went there for 2 weeks and they were like, oh, okay, that was fun. They sold it back to Greece. But like
yeah.
they actually followed through on this fantasy.
Hello, I'm Jack, and you're listening to the Here, There, and Everywhere podcast, an interview show about the Beatles' influence in the past, present, and future across the universe and across generations. Welcome back to the Here, There, and Everywhere podcast. I'm your host, Jack Lawless. Thank you all for your continued support of the show. If this is your first time listening, welcome. You are in for a fantastic first episode. I'm thrilled to say we have a very special guest on the podcast today, the legendary Rob Sheffield. Rob has been a music journalist for over 20 years. He's a contributing editor to Rolling Stone, where he writes about music, TV, and pop culture. Rob has interviewed both Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr, and wrote a book about the Beatles titled Dreaming the Beatles, which I highly recommend you check out. The link to the book and the other things discussed in this episode will all be linked in the podcast description. Thanks for listening, and I hope you'll enjoy. Hey, Rob, thank you so much for coming on the show. How are you doing?
Great, Jack. Great to meet you.
It's so nice to meet you, too. It's an honor to have you on.
Big fan.
Oh, yeah, I'm a huge fan of yours as well. And the Beatles, and I'm glad we both share that fandom.
Yes.
What was the first time that you ever heard the Beatles?
The first time I heard the Beatles, I was 5 years old, and I was watching TV, and there was a movie on called Help. And it's funny that Help is, it's the least, well, if you count Magical Mystery Tour, I guess it's not the Beatles' least taken seriously movie, but I happen to love it. And for me, it was seeing the Beatles and hearing the Beatles and experiencing the whole Beatles cosmology for the first time. So the movie begins, if you know it, with, the four Beatles in black and white footage. They're doing the song Help with acoustic guitars. They're wearing like black turtlenecks and leotards. And they're just doing this song and they're singing together about their feelings. And I was like, these are a bunch of grown men and they're telling this really personal, emotional story. And the friends are like helping him tell his story because he says, when I was young, when I was young. And, they're just not like they're listening to his story. They're helping him tell his story. And it was mind blowing on every possible level. And it just got better from there. And so Help was my gateway.
So were you instantly hooked when you saw that movie at 5 years old?
Absolutely. Well, and it's funny how the movie is paced because then, the next song, they're sitting on the floor of their shared living room and they're doing You've Got to Hide Your Love Away. And, later in the movie, there's You're Gonna Lose That Girl and Ticket to Ride and like all these songs. So I was hearing them as they happened in the movie with no preconceptions of who the Beatles were or where these songs were coming from or what role they played in the Beatles story. And it was honestly, it was like just walking into my living room and suddenly finding, the Kuiper belt and, the asteroids orbiting Neptune suddenly there. Everything was different. The world was bigger and broader and wider and much more fun.
And what were your thoughts when you first heard those songs as such a young kid?
Well, they were so clearly personal and emotional in a way that at that time in the 1970s, it was really unusual to sort of encounter that, but that there was so much boyish enthusiasm. It's like a cartoon. That's something, John said it was crap. You said it was like we were being extras in our own movie. It was like a cartoon, and it was like a cartoon. It was shenanigans and hijinks, but you know there was an awful lot of emotional stuff going on in the songs and in their interactions, and their four personalities coming together in really different ways and in really subtle ways, in ways that certainly seem, you know, accessible to me when I watch it now, no matter how many times I've seen it. But it was really wild that like it introduced me to these four boys who are also men and men who are also boys who had this unique sort of bond, this unique sort of friendship, and they were having adventures, kind of like other gangs that you'd see on kiddie TV, like, Scooby Doo and his pals, solving mysteries in the Mystery Machine. Help isn't so far from an episode of Scooby Doo in a lot of ways, but you know they're singing these astounding songs that are very personal and very emotionally forthright. I think the Help songs are totally underrated. So to me, I fell in love with the music. I fell in love with them. I fell in love with everything on screen. The way that Eleanor Braun in that movie is, a co-adventurer with them. She's on this equal level. She's the one who knows the plot. She's like, I am not what I seem. Like, she's very much like the women characters in the songs they were writing in those times. She's very independent and very adventurous and she's got her own story. She's not just, a side character in this story.
So what happened after that? When did you start to become a fan? Did you go to the record store like right away and take a deep dive into their catalog? Did you watch A Hard Day's Night?
Goodness, I was way too young, so I didn't know, where these songs were from. I couldn't go to a record store and certainly not buy the records. I But my sisters and I, because my sisters and I, we were all watching and we all kind of like fell together. My sisters and I are around the same age. I was 5, they were 4 and 3. So we were like 3 kids very close together in age. And we were all just kind of like stunned by what we saw. And so Channel 56, which was the UHF station in Boston, they played A Hard Day's Night an awful lot. And they played it like a few times a year. So we put a tape recorder up to the TV and taped the songs from the movie. So my association with those songs, so to me, I hear the song the night before, I still hear a bomb going off halfway through, because that's when they're doing the recording session on Stonehenge. And Leo McKern and his gang blow up the recording session on Salisbury Plain. But to me, like, that's how I first heard those songs, but also it's how I first heard the Beatles. And hearing a song like Ticket to Ride, which is just an astoundingly adult song, and I felt incredibly mature for my age, which again was 5. It's not that hard to feel mature for 5, but I felt like they were telling this story that was a little bit above. It was a little over my head. I was definitely aware that I was too young to understand the full impact of this story, but very plain spoken, very emotional. It was a new way of feeling and a new way of moving through the world.
When did you first become interested in writing?
I was interested in writing, I guess, around the same time. I was a little kid. I was always reading stuff, Encyclopedia Brown, Sherlock Holmes, stuff like that. And I I was always reading, and so I was always writing, and I would make up Beatles sort of fanfic adventure stories. I would draw little Beatles cartoons. I wasn't like a good drawer, so my comic artist sensibilities didn't have a chance to develop very far. But you know, the Beatles played a huge role in my imagination, like ever since then. And so for me, like writing was just kind of the natural form it took.
And can you walk us through your career? How did you go from writing Beatles fan fictions to working at Rolling Stone and writing Beatles articles and a book about the Beatles?
Yeah, I just always kept writing about music. I kept writing about a lot of things, but music was the topic I just kept returning to. And, I went to school, I went to grad school in English, and I still had that passion to write about music. I kept writing about music, and it was the sort of thing of like, I did it for fun, freelance, and started to get paid for it. And eventually that became like the main thing I did. That became my career. And it was something that I was so madly passionate about and enthusiastic about. It seemed strange to think that it had become my life's work, but it did, and I've been doing it for just an awful long time since then. I still crazy about new music. I'm still always looking for my next new favorite bands, my next new favorite records, my next new favorite artists, and there's always so much more out there, so much more than anybody could keep up with. So I never have trouble finding new stuff to fall in love with, but some stuff like the Beatles or Dylan or Aretha Franklin or David Bowie just follows you around for life. You hear
Yeah.
it once and you're just hooked.
Has your career led you to any personal encounters with any members of the Beatles?
I've interviewed them, Paul and Ringo. I've done a fair amount of writing about the Beatles over the years for Rolling Stone. The so I've you know Paul and Ringo are I know through just doing interview situations. And but I feel like the deepest level of personal contact is still with the music, like, that's nothing could really like compare to that. That's how we know these people. So after Paul did that amazing Hulu documentary last year with Rick Rubin, the 321 documentary, where he's just two guys in a studio listening to their songs. And it's funny that that's such a great documentary and so overshadowed just a few months later by Get Back, that at this point, I feel like now it's the great forgotten Beatles documentary of
Yeah.
2021. Like, this was less than a year ago, and it was so snowballed under by the Get Back phenomenon. So I think we're about to see a revival of 321, because that's incredible. And there was nothing like it before, with just, Paul just full on geeking out about all these individual instrumental parts. But I wrote something about it for Rolling Stone, and I guess Paul saw it and liked it. And he wanted to do this three-way Zoom interview with me and Rick Rubin and him. And, they were very generous, like, we were expecting like maybe 20 or 30 minutes in our wildest fantasy imaginations. And they just stayed on the line for a couple hours because they were just enjoying just talking about this music. It was just incredibly fun.
As a Beatles fan, what was it like the first time you met Paul and Ringo?
Well, again, like, you feel like these people through their music, and in a way that's, the main relationship, and, even like, encountering them in an interview situation, or any kind of like real life situation, that's one part of, whatever kind of personal memories that you have with them. But it's really like, I feel like no matter how many times I would interview Paul, it could never approximate to like listening to him sing For No One, when I was 15 years old. I feel like that's as close as anybody can get to Paul McCartney, really. Like, he puts himself in the music, and Ringo very much the same way.
Yeah, I mean, I
Ri-
completely agree. Like, I've never met Paul, and every time I've tried to imagine what it would be like meeting Paul, I just can't imagine it. I can't imagine what I would say. Maybe just because he's larger than life, and I don't know.
and we've known them our whole lives, and we've gone through changes with them.
Yeah.
Sometimes, George is someone who, like, I've had a lot of identification with through my life, and sometimes I feel like, you know bearded, sage, grumpy adult sitting in his garden, like, complaining about Maya and, the world.
Yeah.
And sometimes I feel like that George, and sometimes I feel like, boyish, it's a hard day's night, and like, I can't believe I get to do this. I'm in a movie playing myself. I've got that incredibly funny scene where I'm making fun of the producer and the director, like, well, you won't mess with the basic rugged concept of my personality, and that he is just so, quite prepared for that eventuality. He's doing his George dry humor, and he's got these great scenes. And of course, he's showing off for Patty Boyd, who he winds up marrying. And just sometimes I feel like that totally boyish, enthusiastic George. Sometimes I feel like, old, severe, living in the material world George. And sometimes I feel like, even older than that, just kind of like mellowing with time, solo George Harrison album. I know you're a big fan of that 1979 self-titled album.
Oh
I
yeah,
am too.
yeah,
We could talk about that all day, but
yeah.
but I feel like different phases of my life, I have different identifications with them. And, we know all these Beatles, we carry them with us.
Well, I mean, if I was to ever meet Paul, I feel like a part of me would be very inclined to say, "Hey, Paul, do you remember that bus ride in 10th grade when this happened?" And
Absolutely.
obviously, he would say, "No, I have no idea what you're talking about." But yes, we grew up with them, and we have this relationship with them, and they are our friends, and they're always there, you know?
Absolutely. They've seen us at our worst moments, like, we've told them things we wouldn't tell our best friends. They've seen us at our happiest and at our saddest. They've seen us when we shut out the rest of the world and just put on the headphones and just, looked for moments of solace or moments of escape or moments of celebration. But I feel like the Beatles see us at our most extreme.
Yeah, and they always answer their text messages too.
Absolutely.
So I take it the Beatles have influenced your life in a pretty huge way.
Yeah, pretty much every possible way. They've pretty much like influenced just a lot of how I see the world, how I experience the world. Certainly, like, the values that the Beatles stood for, just in terms of constant curiosity, that they were always learning something. And people make fun of that about them, especially John, that he was always learning about something and getting gung ho about this latest fad or philosophy he was into. And then 6 months later, it'd be something else. But just
Right.
that mystique of lifelong curiosity that the Beatles had and lifelong growth, that to me is just endlessly fascinating. That Paul McCartney, in his capacity, his endless capacity for enthusiasm, which he had more than the others, but they all had it. They all had this superhuman kind of enthusiasm that allowed them to do what they did for as long as they did. And people say, oh, they were only together for 10 years. It's completely insane that they were able to do it for a month. Anybody else trying to fill their shoes would have crumbled in 12 to 16 hours. It's just
Yeah.
not possible to be that enthusiastic, that on, and that introspective at the same time. It's an almost impossible balancing act. And, that the Beatles were able to sort of, combine that curiosity, that enthusiasm, that enthusiasm, that sort of embrace of the world in all these different forms, intellectually and culturally and emotionally, politically. And so I find that influences everything about the way I see the world, really.
Now, do you think that naturally you're more inclined to go that route and the Beatles have kind of encouraged that and brought that out of you? Or do you think that because you're a fan of the Beatles, that's why you're inclined to go that route?
That's a good question. I kind of feel, part of my writing about the Beatles, very fixated on how the world was different pre Beatles in ways that we're still kind of catching up with and taking for granted. Certainly in ways, in terms of, just my adult life as a male Beatle fan, and sort of like the way they defined new types of adult maleness in a way that so unprecedented on that kind of cultural level. And that's something that is really different from, I'm very conscious that this is different from how my ancestors went through this time. My father and my grandfathers and my great grandfathers, this is different from their time of life because, we have the Beatles now. And it's funny that I'm always fixated on ways that the world was different. I enjoyed that movie Yesterday, where the guy goes back in time to a world with no Beatles. And I was like, wait a minute, he's got a Beatle haircut. Every male in this movie has a Beatle haircut. None of the male characters in this movie would have this haircut if the Beatles didn't exist. You
That's
know,
right.
like,
Yeah.
and that's just one of the millions of ways. Something I mentioned in the book was like going to therapy. And it was so shocking, when I was a little kid in the 70s to read about John talking out loud about going to therapy. I could not even imagine any of the adult males in my world going to therapy or talking about it in any kind of public way. And, that's not even one of the top 1,000 ways John Lennon changed the world, but, it's, it's there even in the tiniest details.
You mentioned the Beatles' haircuts, and when I was younger, I was about 12 years old. I grew my hair down to my shoulders, obviously inspired by the Beatles. And it came time for a haircut. But and I was dreading that day, but I found solace in the fact that, this is my John Lennon in 1966, Almira, Spain, how I won the war. This is my haircut time. And I would say, okay, it's going to be all right.
I love that. But it's funny just because, you know, your Beatles are so different from other people's Beatles, and that the Beatles are so universal on a way that's not like other pop culture experiences or cultural experiences in general. Um, I'm always learning from my nieces and nephews and how crazy about the Beatles they are, which is so amusing to my sisters whose moms these kids are. And it's fun because when my sisters and I were little kids in the 70s, it was so amusing to our parents that we were so crazy about the Beatles and that we wanted to listen to the Beatles all the time and that we were obsessed with details about the Beatles. And my parents would always say, they broke up, right? The Beatles, they don't even exist anymore. And they thought it was so weird that we were still into the Beatles after they broke up. And, through the 70s, people were still really weirded out by the fact that little kids like us were into the Beatles. And now,
Huh.
now it's my sister's turn. Now they're the moms, and like their little kids, they were born in the late 90s and in the 2000s and in the 20 teens. And
Right,
these little kids, they have their relationship with the Beatles. My nephew was showing me the Lego yellow submarine that he was building.
right.
And he was like, okay, this is Paul and this is John. And I'm like, yeah, I know, but that's that's something I love about the Beatles. And that's something that is, it's so funny that the Beatles, they just something about the way that they connect with the mind, the old mind, the young mind, different types of minds, another kind of mind, as the song says. But
Right.
that that nobody ever has to sort of convince young people about the Beatles that there's something about the music that just sort of insinuates.
This is actually something you talked about in your book, Dreaming the Beatles. Why are the Beatles ever present, and why are they infinitely relevant?
It's a wild kind of thing. It's something that I've spent my whole life trying to understand without getting any closer to figuring out the mystery than I am now. But I just want to see the mystery a little clearer. But it's wild that the Beatles are the world's favorite thing, and they have been the world's favorite thing for my entire life. And there's no Beatles of anything else. You can't say that they're the world's favorite music because there isn't a Beatles of movies, there isn't a Beatles of books, there isn't a Beatles of food, there isn't a Beatles of anything else. And there is just the Beatles who, this extremely strange, collection, anthology, as it were, of cultural collisions happening in this place and in this time, but it happened around the world. And to me, the interesting thing about the Beatles and why I wanted to write Dreaming the Beatles, I wanted to write a book about the Beatles that wasn't about the 60s because it makes sense that the Beatles were big in the 60s, right? Like if they weren't the biggest band in the 60s, somebody else would have been. To me, the weirdest thing about the Beatles is that after they broke up, they just kept getting bigger. They just kept getting more beloved. They just kept getting more famous, and that they're more famous now than they were when they actually existed. And so to me, like the really weird question is, what was happening in the 60s? It's like, why now? Why is it that the Beatles that, they do not fade with time? Why is it that, why is it that they resonate through time, that they travel through time the way they do, that just other artifacts of culture just don't?
Right.
To me, like the fascinating thing about the Beatles is what they mean to right now. And it's beyond anything that the Beatles would have guessed, even at their most, you know, megalomaniac, egomaniac, like we're going to be the toppermost of the poppermost. They
Right.
would not have imagined that, over 50 years after they stopped existing as a band, that, they would be the world's favorite thing. They would be the world's
Yeah.
favorite music, also the world's favorite story of friendship, the world's favorite symbol of friendship, the world's favorite team. It's just a really unusual cultural story, and I feel like it's a permanent one. The way something like Romeo and Juliet is a permanent cultural story, like or Julius Caesar or Alice in Wonderland. These are permanent cultural myths that the Beatles are just they're one of them.
They really are larger than life. And like you said before, your Beatles are different than my Beatles. Everybody's Beatles are different. So I wonder if, do you think Paul McCartney's Beatles are different than everybody else's? Like when he sees the Get Back documentary shatter streaming records across the internet and Let It Be shoots to the top of the charts 50 years later, do you think that he identifies with the group that's doing all that? Or do you think he has a different story?
Well, it's very interesting. Honestly, it's crazy that he keeps making music. He keeps like making records. He loves that he is still a working contemporary artist. And I feel like part of how he has really sort of, come to really like enjoy and relish the Beatles legacy and the way that he can enjoy it is just because he's making his own music. I mean, McCartney 3 was great. Egypt Station was like just a fantastic album. To me, that's a top 5 McCartney solo album. Chaos and Creation is way up there too. It's not like he had a burst of success in his 20s and he's been sort of riding the wave since then. He It wouldn't be enough for him to be that kind of artist. That's why he's even on his new tour. Paul just started doing his new tour, his Got Back tour. And he's doing, half a dozen new songs in the set, and like and he has a joke he's been saying for years on his shows. He's like, yeah, we can tell that you don't like the new songs as much because we can see, you know everybody puts their phones away when we do a new one. Like I do something like Penny Lane, everybody gets their phone out. I do Queenie Eye and it's like a black hole. But he's like, but I just like doing them. And you can tell he takes a lot of pride in that, as well he should, because there's honestly like no comparable example. You go see the Rolling Stones, even without Charlie Watts, they're still a fantastic band. I saw them on their 2019 tour. I saw a few of their shows. they were like completely phenomenal. They weren't doing any songs from 2019. They were really smart. They knew nobody wanted to. They didn't do anything from the 20th century. The 21st century. Like they knew that they weren't going to waste people's time with that. They weren't going to insult
Right.
anybody's intelligence. Paul McCartney, he's like, but I'm still writing new songs. He's probably written a new song while we've been having this conversation. But he's like,
Yeah.
he is a compulsive music maker, and that is something that is beautiful and unique about him.
Do you have a favorite fact about the Beatles that some people may not know?
Wow, there's so many. To me, like kind of like the most fascinating Beatle facts are not the sort of esoteric little known stories, but they're the very public stories that everybody knows, so we take them for granted and we don't see how weird they are. For me, my absolute favorite Beatles story is just that that John and Paul, two people, so absolutely unique, were born at the same time in the same town, and they found each other and they formed this band with George, and they found Ringo. And in this town where it could not have been more impossible for them to imagine being heard by the rest of England compared to the world. I always love that great John quote from 1970, the Lennon Remembers interview, where he says, even London was something we used to dream of, and London's nothing. And I just love that because, yes, like it, you listen to the Beatles with their raw accents, and you know their raw everything about them. Like it was completely mind blowingly, like even in their most arrogant moments, they could not have imagined that they would mean to the world what they meant, and certainly not mean to the world what they have kept meaning ever since then. And something when you see A Hard Day's Night and Help Now, just how abrasive and provincial those accents are, it's really hard to understand what they're saying if you're like a little American kid and you've never heard English accents before, because these are really particular English accents. It must have been really hard, for people in the rest of England to understand a lot of what they were saying. There's a lot of like really local Liverpool slang. But the fact that the Beatles happened at all, that they found each other, that they had that will and that ability to create collectively this kind of music, and that they were able to sort of keep inspiring each other, keep competing with each other, keep challenging with each other. It's the most obvious part of the Beatles story. And yet to me, that's the weirdest and strangest part. Then they broke up to start new bands with their wives, which to me is like, that's again, it's in plain sight. It's not a hidden or little known or esoteric Beatles story. But as a culture, we have not even begun to reckon with the weirdness of that. There's nothing even comparable. Like you can't imagine like the Stones at their heyday with like Mick and Keith saying, we've decided that, Mick is going to make music with Bianca, and, Keith and Anita are going to form the Plastic Pallenberg band. And like that there is like not that like other band, like the Beatles did so many things nobody had done before. Lots of those things people copied because the Beatles made it sound fun and made it sound easy, and so people copied them. Like even the whole thing of like writing your own songs, which was you know not something you were supposed to do at that point. And
Yeah.
after that, it became something that people really took pride in. But Buddy Holly, he wrote his own songs, but he didn't brag about it because there was no percentage in it. You didn't get any cool points from that. The Beatles,
Right.
they wanted to be the names in the credits. They always loved when they saw Carole King's name, Jerry Goffin's name, Smokey Robinson's name in the credits of a single, and they wanted that tiny little part of the story for themselves along with everything else. So it's wild that there's so many things about the Beatles that are like public property and common knowledge that we
Yeah.
all know, that we've all known all our lives. But when you pay attention to them, like the fact that like John and Paul left the Beatles to make music with Yoko and Linda, that is absolutely, there is nothing comparably as weird in in rock history or pop history. It's not like NWA broke up because
Right.
Easy E and Ice Cube wanted to make music with their wives. Like there's no scenario anywhere in pop culture where this would happen.
I never thought of that in those terms before because I've always just taken it as for granted. It's
you know
just a fact.
we grew up with these stories in plays, right?
Yeah.
And it's like imagine like Marvel Comics ceases to exist because Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, they're like, we're going to go make comics with our wives now.
Yeah.
Like there's no comparable example of this. And the fact that the Beatles were so modern in their attitudes about women and about collaborating with women, and in terms of you know, seeking as romantic partners women who are artists who had their own careers, their own ideas, their own reputations, their own histories, their own artistic visions. I
Hmm.
mean, that is something that is, it still seems like really wildly ahead of its time.
Yeah. And I also think that they might have felt the most comfortable doing that since they probably felt like a family unit for 10 years. And then the most comfortable next step would be to go with your family and make music, continue making music with a different family, but still have that intimate feel.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's over because they'd done so many things before that seemed like completely out of whack with history that this must have seemed just one more. And like this, but this is one where like all other bands were like, nope, can't even imagine such a thing. It's like it's completely inconceivable that this happened. And and the weirdest part of it is that this wasn't, just like a drug induced mood that they were in for a few months. It isn't something you can imagine like some bands having a stoned fantasy of doing that. But like these marriages actually lasted. Both John and Paul, these women that they married, they stayed with the rest of their lives till death did them part. In rock and roll, considering rock stars who got married in 1969 who stayed married for the rest of their lives, that's got to be a pretty short list, right?
Yeah,
And
there's probably only two of them.
yeah, probably only those two. And that John and Paul, like that, that those, and that they both kept those creative partnerships continued along with the marriages. Like it, like completely inconceivable that 10 years later, 1980, John is still making music with Yoko, Paul is still making music with Linda. Those marriages still exist, and it's just kind of astounding. Everything about that story is so weird, but like you said, we grow up with that story and we take it for granted. But when you look at it, it's weirder than the little known parts of the story. Like a little known story, something I always think is surprisingly unknown is, the episode in 1967 where they all decided to buy a Greek island together
Yeah,
and move in, and
yeah,
and that they actually did it. They actually bought an island from Greece, which is completely insane. And they bought a Greek island and they went there for 2 weeks and they were like, oh, okay, that was fun. They sold it back to Greece. But like
yeah,
they actually followed through on this fantasy, like that they were going to, the four Beatles and their families and their entourage were going to move to a remote island off Greece and just have their own private communes there and their own recording studios. Like this is completely insane. Like no band, like this, you hear about bands like Khan doing this. They have a castle that they move into. But, like they're not the Beatles, okay? Like they're not like the most four famous people in the world. It's like, and stories like that are so mind blowing, but they fit into the larger story, which is that it's crazy that the Beatles found each other and they were able to create this community that has outlasted them. The Beatles broke up, but the Beatles community worldwide said, "Okay, you four guys can break up if you want to. That's part of our communal story now, but this community is still together." And all four
right.
Beatles found that really bizarre, and all four of them reacted against it and resisted it at different points in their lives. But I love how John and George, they found peace with that, like in their lifetimes. And certainly Paul and Ringo in recent years have really come to embrace that in ways that are really beautiful.
If John had lived and it came the year 1985, 1990, do you think there would have been a Beatles reunion?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I think it would have happened in 82, maybe 83 or 84. 84 would have been a good year for it. We know from, the final days of John's life, sadly, he was testifying in the Beatles lawsuit against the Broadway play Beatlemania, and they were suing to shut it down. And John testified under oath a couple days after Thanksgiving that Beatlemania would hurt him financially. And he said, I and the other three Beatles have plans to do a reunion concert film and tour the world and make music together again. And, we're like, well, okay, maybe this is something that would have happened. He was under oath when he said it. This was a, legal deposition. I
Right.
learned this book from Peter. I learned the story from Peter Doggett's amazing book, You Never Give Me Your Money, The Beatles After the Breakup, which is just just heartbreaking, also relentlessly hilarious book, like about this weird friendship that they still had that still lasted in all these inconvenient and infuriating ways. But that, in the final days of John's life, he was testifying under oath that, the Beatles were indeed, they did have future plans. And I feel like after Double Fantasy had established his comeback, he would have been comfortable with working in that environment again. And I feel like, you know, George with his self-titled album, he would have been on board because the other two were. And George did a lot of wacky things, for cash flow in the 80s. So I think they would have found enough common ground to do it.
Yeah.
I think maybe, I guess everybody's got an alternate timeline in my head, and I'd love to hear yours. But I imagine after Double Fantasy was a hit, that the Milk and Honey songs would have come out in 1982, and that those would have been even bigger because I think Milk and Honey is an even better album. That's a incredibly great album.
Yeah.
So many great, and you could tell that those songs aren't on Double Fantasy because they're just too happy and they're just
Yeah.
too fun. And he wanted Double Fantasy to this big, like we're still married and we're still together and we're making music again. Like let's
Here I
embrace
am.
these lives that we've lived. Double
Yeah.
Fantasy is very much that kind of concepts album. And Milk and Honey, he just had like a bunch of really fun songs that kind of didn't fit the concept. I feel like Milk and Honey would have come out in 1982 and been like an even bigger hit. And Paul would have had Tug of War, and John would have had Gone Trop. I mean, George would have had Gone Troppo, which
Hmm.
was not a big hit, and
Right.
definitely didn't deserve to be. But I feel like that would have been the place where they were like, okay, 82, we've proved what we need to prove in our solo paths. Let's make an album, and it would have come out in 1984, I think.
Do you think it would have been as big as they were in the 60s?
It would have been very different, and people have complained about it the way people constantly complained when the Stones made a new album in the 80s, or when
Right.
the Who made a new album in the 80s, or when Aretha Franklin made a new album in the 80s, or Smokey Robinson. Every time those albums happen, people are like, well, it's not like what they did in the 60s, but the they kept going, and now those records sound fantastic. I mean, a lot of those people made terrible production choices. God knows, David Bowie and Lou Reed and Bob Dylan made a lot of albums with
Oh
great
yeah.
songs in the 80s with just unbearable production, as I think the surviving Beatles did. Some of the
Yeah.
production on even the really good like Paul and George records, it's got some questionable decisions, but there's I think people would have complained about it, but I think it would have been good. I think it would have been inspired.
Hmm.
I like to imagine, what if Paul brought in his Tug of War songs and John brought in his Milk and Honey songs, and and John's got the Milk and Honey songs, Paul's got the Tug of War songs, George has got, maybe songs that became Wilbury's songs, but they've all got stuff that they can pick on, and and they would inspire each other to create new stuff. And they would have come in with some keepers, and they would have kept going from there. I
Uh,
do think that it would have been like the Stones, where people are always complaining that the new stuff is a sellout. But I mean, it, nobody's life is worse because the Rolling Stones kept making records. Like you like those records or you don't. But nobody in 2022 who is sane is saying it really sucks that the Stones didn't break up. When Keith got busted in '78, like that's just a childish point of view that nobody has anymore. Like whether you like those records or not, nobody wishes they didn't exist.
You mentioned the Beatles creating an 80s record and what the production would have sounded like if they went through with that. There was a 1980 interview with John Lennon in the studio, and in the background you can hear him experimenting with Star Wars sounds like laser gun sound effects. Yeah, it was really cool. Have you ever seen that?
No, I got to check this out.
I will send you the link and I'll put it in the podcast description below too. But I think he was kind of leaning towards like maybe experimenting with Star Wars sounds, seeing how that would fit on a record. Or just maybe they would have gone completely acoustic, like Dark Eyes by Bob Dylan, and just throw that on an 80s album.
I
Who
love that.
knows?
I'm sure they would have done all these things. Wow, I love that Star Wars idea. They just would have got real stoned one night and called George Lucas and said like, "Hey, we want to be in the next Star Wars movie.
Yeah.
We didn't follow through with our Lord of the Rings movie that we were going to make with Stanley Kubrick, but we're going to do this one. You're going to make another Star Wars movie. It's going to be Return of the Beetle Jedi, and make this happen, George." And of course, he would have
Yeah.
done it. Of course, it would have happened. And I feel like the stage was set for them to do all this stuff, and also they were so open to new music in a way that Paul still is something he doesn't get enough credit for. But I love that McCartney 3 remix album. He
Yeah.
had like all these like all these people like doing like crazy things to his songs. He loves to do 4 or 5 seconds live. His Rihanna and Kanye collaboration that probably they wouldn't do live. They probably don't remember it, but like he loves that he made this song with them that was big top 10 hit. He prizes that. And I feel like the Beatles, they would have, in the 80s, I feel like they would have, been making records with, Big Daddy Kane and Marley Marl and Africa Bambaataa. They would have been doing hip hop records. They would have been doing house records with Marshall Jefferson and Kevin Saunderson and Derek May. I feel like the Beatles, they had nothing to lose. They would have tried all these crazy ideas. And of course, a lot of them would have flopped and we'd laugh at them now. But I feel like they would have tried everything. They would have, they would have done a track with Slayer. They would have done, like a track with Terrence Trent D'Arby. God knows they would have made a Prince record. Like, I feel
Right.
like they were so open to experimentation. And, John, like in especially the final year of his life when he started playing music after his long layoff, and he was just getting into post punk that he was just hearing for the first time. The famous story of like he's, you know, in Bermuda in a disco and the DJ puts on Rock Lobster and he's like, wait, this sounds like Yoko stuff. He's like, well, I guess people do care about this stuff. And like, that makes him want to start writing songs again. He's like, made me think it's time to wake up the wife and get me guitar out.
Right.
And it's a beautiful story that like the B-52s, I'm sure the last thing that they had on their mind was John Lennon hearing them and being inspired to write songs again. It's
Yeah.
completely insane. But, it's funny that it was that set off John Lennon and stuff like Blondie and Public Image Limited. Like, I feel like he would have been, he and Paul and George and Ringo in their different ways, they would have been connected to stuff that was new and going on in a way that the Stones and the Who weren't.
Yeah, absolutely. They were always sponges and mirrors of their influences. And
Absolutely.
I think you're right. That would have totally continued. Would have loved to hear what that sounded like in the 90s too.
Totally. And it's funny, I love those Fireman records that like Paul
Yeah.
made with youth. It's funny that like lots of people who love Paul McCartney like don't know that those records exist and haven't heard them. And it's funny that like, you hear them in a sort of blind set. The first time I heard one of them, like friend was playing it for me and didn't tell me who it was. He just told me it was the Fireman. I was like, this is so good. When is this from? Like, and you know, he took about 20 minutes to tell me it was Paul McCartney. And I was like, well, there you go. I had no idea. But it was, I feel like that side of them really would have flowered if they'd stayed together in the 80s because they didn't have to prove anything. They didn't have to still keep racking up hits.
Honorable mention to the song "Sing the Changes" by Fireman.
Absolutely.
Love that song.
Well, you're a big fan of the 70s George, I know, which I am too.
Oh yes. Oh yeah, yeah. 33 and 1/3 and self-titled all day long. I love every single song on there. I love those two albums.
Love those. Pure Smoky is one of my absolute favorite George songs.
Yeah.
It's so funny. It's a song that hardly anybody knows. It's just like buried on this album. And you play it for literally anyone. And, and it makes them just fall in love with George all over again. It makes them fall in love with Smokey Robinson again. Smokey
Yeah.
Robinson, of course, totally loved it. And, of course, the way that George loved Smokey Robinson and his music consistently and like kept like going back to that sort of sacred ground is like such a beautiful story in itself. But I love that there are these songs that George just had on his solo albums that even people who love him and look up to him and admire his music, like probably still haven't checked out. There's still so
Yeah.
much to be discovered.
Yeah, yeah, there really is. And even on his record Somewhere in England, he does
Yeah.
the cover of the traditional song Baltimore Oriole,
Yeah.
and he makes it sound like his own song. And I think that's when he was making his most energetic music. I think that's when he was enjoying it the most. I think that's the golden age of George's solo career, aside from All Things Must Pass. I love it.
I love it too. And I love like All Things Must Pass. I wonder sometimes if like the way that overshadows the other 70s records and the 80s ones as well, that there's that there's none of those records, none of them tried to be All Things Must Pass, so they were slept on. But like it's astounding how you mentioned like 33 and a third and like an extra texture and self-titled, that there are great songs on all those albums that are absolutely first rate. And it's wild to think that at one point in the 70s George had to put out a George Harrison greatest hits album where side two was his old Beatles songs because like they just they didn't they didn't have enough faith, or he didn't have enough faith maybe in his solo work to even pad out side two of his solo greatest hits album. And you think, what if they put, If You Believe, or, like Ooh Baby, or, Pure Smoky, or Give Me Love. I mean, that was on side one because that was a big hit, but that's one of my favorite George Harrison songs that's become really obscure.
Yeah. Yeah, there's so many. Like Beautiful Girl,
Yeah.
that's a good
Dark
one. I
Sweet
think
Lady you mentioned.
we were talking about Dark Sweet Lady and Here Comes the Moon,
Yeah.
which is a great sequel to Here Comes the Sun that not many people know about, but they should.
I love what a specific LA 79 that record is. Like it's
Yeah.
definitely you know, he's like, I've done my world traveling records. He's like, I really want to sound like a rock star in a studio with a lot of money, and maybe a fair bit amount of substances in a slick professional recording studio in LA in 1979, and like absolutely nails that vibe. And that it's a really great, sort of like Toto, Steely Dan, Tom Petty, kind of like totally like great mainstream 79 rock record. It's wild that it's so slept on.
Is George your favorite Beatle?
I've had to confront this question. I avoid this question all the time. Honestly, it's Paul. I'm a Paul boy.
Really?
Yes, I've always been a Paul boy. I have my personal connections with all four of them. And of course, I think of them all as my favorite Beatle. But I've realized as I've gotten older, just the weirdness of Paul McCartney is something that, because he's the most famous person in the world and arguably the most beloved human being on earth, his only real competition being Ringo, I guess. But they're, the two most beloved people on earth. And, you think of the competition and it's like, no, the competition is really provincial compared. But the Paul McCartney is just so profoundly weird. It's weird that he keeps doing this, that he is, he's going to turn 80 on the road somewhere playing
Yeah.
for 4 hours until people are carried out on stretchers. And Paul is like, what? People want to leave? I want to stay. He hates to leave the stage. He hates it. He has to be dragged off for the encore. And every single time I've seen him, I'm sure you've noticed the same thing. Every time he comes back for the encore, he's running. He's
Yeah.
never not running back for the encore. He did it as, like in the 60s shows. He does it in the 70s shows. He runs back for the encore. He hates leaving the stage. It's
Yeah.
crazy. And there's really, I mean, there's not any kind of precedent for somebody doing that who's still at the absolute top of their game the way he is as an absolutely like top of the game live performer.
All these contemporary artists hoping to retire at 65 are like, oh my gosh, he's making me look bad right now.
Yes, unbelievable. And that he is also 80 and so open to new influences, so open to new music, and so focused on what he's doing next, rather than resting on his laurels. He will talk about the old songs when people want to talk about the old songs. He, as he told Rick Rubin, he's like, I'm as big a Beatles geek as anyone, but he's what he's really excited about is the music he's making today and tomorrow. And, even if those albums weren't great, I would love, that sort of side of him that those records bring out. But like you listen to an album like Egypt Station and there's lesser stuff, there's really good stuff, and then there's like completely phenomenal stuff like Dominoes, which, to me is a top 5 solo Paul song. Like Catch Me in the Right Mood, if I'd maybe had a cocktail or two, like I'd be arguing that's a top 5 Paul song, period. But like there's certainly no precedent for any rock star, any really working musician in their late 70s to write a song as good as Dominoes. And nobody even knows that song. It's just an album track.
Right.
It's a deep cut. And I feel like these are songs we're going to keep discovering for the rest of our lives and going like, like this temporary secretary effect. Like it's so funny that
Yeah.
Temporary Secretary came out and nobody noticed it for 30 years. The song was always there and like just nobody noticed it. And then sort of collectively people were like, oh wow, Temporary Secretary is this phenomenal, great like new wave 1980 song that happens to be by Paul McCartney. And it took people 30 years to discover that song. And I feel like, we're still going to be catching up with these songs and still catching up with aspects of his personality. Like the way he's always written songs about women, which is something that has always been ahead of his time, and something that when I interviewed him last year, and I guess felt adventurous enough to press him on this a bit, but I was like, you were writing songs about women in 1965, and you were talking about their ideas and what they had to say, and the nurse in Penny Lane. You're talking about she's imagining that she's in a play. You're talking about her imagination. You don't tell us what she's wearing or what she looks like, who she reminds you of. Like that's you're telling about what's going on in her head, and the way that he empathizes with these female characters in his songs. You know, drive my car. I asked a girl what she wanted to be, which is, a very strange
Mm.
question when you think about it, to be asking girls in 1965 when, at the time that Rubber Soul came out, my mom was pregnant with me, and she got fired for getting pregnant with me because she was a school teacher. And, the whole thing of like a pregnant woman, like having a job was just unheard of. She was going to be a mom. So she was fired for being pregnant. And that was just how things were done back then. And, that the songs, Paul is singing about women with jobs, in the 60s. A song I love that I asked him a bit about because I always wanted to hear him talk about it is Another Day, which is another great Paul song that people forget about.
Yeah.
And it was his first solo single after leaving the
Yeah.
Beatles. And it's this song about this, woman who has a job and she's single. She's on her own in the city. She's living her life. It's like it's completely out of whack with any song that any male songwriter was writing about women in 1970. And I feel like that's an aspect of Paul that, we're still just kind of sort of slowly waking up to.
Yes, and he continues to be progressive as well. I mean, just the other year, he said about the song Laboratory Lil from his McCartney 3 album that was actually about Polythene Pam's girlfriend. So you're right. He's always
I
creating
love that.
women characters from an empathetic point of view.
One of my like fun like late night arguments to have with some of my Beatles friends is we try to brainstorm Paul McCartney songs about men, like and like his lack of interest
Huh.
in men as a topic to write about or sing about or even think about. You could tell Paul McCartney basically does not really care about men, and that
Yeah,
and he's Paul McCartney songs like it's funny that the only one you can think of where there's like a conversation between men is Band on the Run when they're breaking out
right,
of jail. The guy's like, the first one said to the second one there, I hope you're having fun. I'm like, I think the jailer man and Sailor Sam might be the closest he comes to creating male characters in a song.
yeah,
But ultimately, he does not care about men. And if there's a Paul McCartney song about a man, they're talking about a woman. So like, Hey Jude is, his most famous song. It's the Beatles' biggest hit. It's, it's one of the greatest songs ever written. And it's a man talking to another man. And what are they talking about? What else would Paul McCartney talk about?
right,
He's talking to Jude about this woman and like encouraging him to, let this woman into his life. It's like really amazing that Paul has consistently through his career, coming on, 55 years, has written about women in this like really curious, intense way and just does not care about men at all. And it's funny that that's really like kind of I mean, and you try to think about Paul songs where he sings about men. Sometimes he sings about them and he's angry about them. He's complaining about, too many people or whatever. But, you know, he Paul he does not care about men.
The only other one I can think of is Father Mackenzie burying
Yeah, totally.
Eleanor Rigby.
Totally. Yes. Yes. Of course, she gets the last word. Yes. It's like her grave. Yes. And it totally defines him and he has no idea. Like
Yeah,
it's, I mean, it's really kind of amazing that he was singing those songs. He wrote Eleanor Rigby when he was 24. And
yeah,
it, it's something that, you try to imagine like when you're 24 and you're Paul McCartney and you're the biggest pop star that's ever existed. And you could make a fair case that nobody in the history in the human race had been as famous as Paul McCartney was, in 1965, 66.
hmm,
And he's got, swinging London. The world is changing in ways that he helped usher in. And he certainly got a lot of distractions at his door, lots of hedonism, lots of like intellectual pursuits as well as hedonistic pursuits. But certainly there's a lot of other ways he could spend his time other than writing a song about Eleanor Rigby and trying to imagine what her life is like. And
right.
that he did this in a way that still resonates with people, probably like you. I love that song as a little kid, and I love it now as, no longer a particularly young adult. And it is mind blowing to me that he got that right and that he took the time to get that right and that he put the effort into getting that right. He wanted to tell her story, not his story about like, there isn't a, hero Paul McCartney figure who's, I guess virtue signaling is the way we'd put it now, but like he's not a character in the song cheering up Eleanor Rigby. He's just, he's just reporting on her life from what he can observe, what he can imagine. And it's just really astounding that he was doing songs like that when he was 24 and that he's kept that tradition alive his entire career. And like John, and it's funny that this is something that he and John kind of had in common because John would write songs where he was like complaining to men or lecturing at them, but like
Yeah.
basically John, is something, it's a weird kind of theme in John's songwriting, especially in his lyrics and the early part of the Beatles career where he's always worried what men are thinking of him. He's worried that men are like laughing at him or putting him down or thinking he's a fool. He wants them to be envious. He wants to impress them. That's like a theme in his songwriting at this point. But certainly Paul doesn't do something like that. Like you can tell the one song where Paul really tries to write that kind of song is Another Girl. And it's just,
Yeah.
wow, he just does not care enough. He just threw in the towel halfway through with that song.
Yeah.
He just could not relate to that perspective. So it's like he's trying to write a really, like macho, misogynistic, womanizing song. And he just loses interest,
Yeah.
after basically halfway through the first verse, like even in the chorus, he's like, "Oh, another girl." He's like, he is not interested in finishing this song.
Yeah.
It's just there because they needed something to fill out help. And it's so funny that this is he really tried to write this kind of misogynistic song and just couldn't relate to it, even when he was trying to write it.
Well, I think it's fascinating that the only title that's shared between two songs that Paul and John wrote separately is Woman. John had a song Woman in, of course, on Double Fantasy, and Paul, I believe he wrote that in 66 and gave it to, I want to say Peter and Gordon, but I could be wrong.
That's so fascinating. I never
Yeah.
thought of that. I think, yeah, it was Peter and Gordon. And it's wild. I guess I never put those two songs together. That's really incredible.
Yeah, so
That's
that's
that's wild that that's their one shared song title.
yeah, and even in the early days, exactly like you were saying, they were writing songs, She Loves You, Thank You Girl, I Want to Hold Your Hand. It's all about the girl.
Well,
Um,
yeah, and that they were keen to make it very explicit that it's a two-way dialogue. I always loved, that fantastic quote to Mark Lewison in the Beatles recording sessions book in 87, where he said, like the thing with the pronouns, that we are putting in our songs, she loves you, please, please me, from me to you, that thank you, girl, that, we were boys who were like, 18 or 19, and we're singing to an audience of girls who are 16, 17. So, we're speaking to them directly and that we know that they're the ones that are listening and they're the ones that we're writing to impress. And, and
yeah,
he says this like in a really blunt way, but like a lot of what the Beatles did, and a lot of like the sort of, I mean, shocking in retrospect, and I guess also shocking at the time, but the emotional candor and honesty and non-condescendingness that they brought to those songs that was so palpable to their audience at the time. But it very much comes, all the songs that they would write, like their entire careers, separately and together, they come from that challenge of writing songs to these girls that they were, singing to face in rooms like the Cavern, and and just speaking directly to them and plainly to them. And it's really kind of astonishing that that was the challenge. And that's it you can hear that in everything they did the rest of their careers. That set the tone for the kind of honesty that all four of them like aspired to achieve in their work, together or alone. And also, I mean, just like a fact of pop history, then or now, teenage girls are the most sophisticated audience. They're the hardest audience to impress. They're the hardest audience to con. You cannot
hmm
fool the teenage girls. And that's
yeah,
something that, I think that's a huge part of what keeps pop music fresh, at least for me, is that like the teenage girls, they are tough. They do not have legacy artists. They will not fake it for an artist. Like they can really tell when they're being condescended to. They can
right,
tell when somebody's trying to like sell them something phony, and they do not fall for it. And they do not fall for, you know, they do not fall for phoniness in ways that other pop audiences can maybe be fooled or maybe be, conned. And teenage girls are always historically they're the most sophisticated audience, and that's why they're always on the coolest thing before anybody else is. And that's why the Beatles, like, I think really like respected the challenge of writing for them, because they knew that keeping these girls' respect was the hardest artistic challenge that they'd ever face. And they always wrote song for those girls as those girls turned into women. And look at an album like Rubber Soul, and it's just kind of, I feel like Rubber Soul is like like a lot of stuff that we've been talking about in this conversation, like really famous album that just gets weirder when you listen to it and think like these are boys who've become men and they're writing songs about girls who become women.
Hmm.
And, they don't really have to keep rising to the challenge. They could have kept writing, songs about teenage girls. But in Rubber Soul, they're singing
Right.
about girls who have jobs, girls who have to get up in the morning because they have to go to work, girls who have stories, girls who have careers and ambitions, even if it's just to be a star, girls who have philosophies of life, and girls who even speak languages they don't speak, like Michelle, which is a song that I loved when I was a little boy. Then I hated Michelle when I was a teenager, and I hated it for most of my life. And it's really only the last 10 years that I've been like, wow, Michelle is a great song. How did I not notice how brilliant Michelle was? I was like, God, has it come to that? But we all have those moments with Beatles songs. Part of being a
Yeah.
Beatles fan, you just like a song for years, or you stop paying attention to it. Then it's like, wow, I've been underrating Michelle all these years. That's like a
Yeah.
nutso song. Like, who else was writing songs in 1965, like on that level of, of just pure candor and just non-condescension. And I think like that experience of writing for those teen girl fans in the early 60s, I think that's what toughened the Beatles for the songs that they would write all through the 60s and 70s and through their careers.
Oh, absolutely. I think a good example is She's Leaving Home. I think a lot of teenage girls during the counterculture movement probably related to that song, like fighting with their parents or threatening to run away. And it's another great example
Yes.
of Paul writing from that third person point of
Yes.
view.
I guess what strikes me about this song, it's funny, that's a song I always found so threatening as a little kid. And I've never really made the crossover to actually liking that song. Because like
Oh,
I
really?
take the parents' side. And I did when I was a little kid. I was like, they make some good points here. I took the parents' side. I was like, that girl's an idiot. She'll be home in a week. I guess like the real life Melanie Co, she was home in a couple weeks. Like she did go back. Like, like Man from the Motor Trade. Yeah, you don't want to hang out with that guy. That's
Right.
that's
Yeah.
that's not the guy you want to like. You don't want to put your eggs in that basket. I think part of what I love about Sergeant Pepper, even more than other Beatles albums, more and more, is the empathy toward old people. And that's a really funny and underrated aspect of the Beatles games that,
Hmm.
they were writing songs about old people. It wasn't with the kind of contempt that, Dylan or the Stones or, the Velvet Underground or whoever were bringing to songs about old people, that they always had that empathy for them. And, you can hear that in She's Leaving Home, where, they do it as a dialogue where like Paul is singing the girl's story and John is sitting, and they recorded the vocals together in the studio, according to Jeff Emmerich's book. And they're sitting facing each other in the studio on stools and singing at the same time. And John is just singing things that are like literally verbatim what Auntie Mimi would say when they would fight. Never a thought for ourselves. We sacrificed all our lives to get by.
We never thought of ourselves. She's leaving. Never a thought for ourselves. We struggled hard all our lives to get by. She's leaving.
And all these, kind of like stereotypical, like old stiff upper lip English, old people songs to think. But, you think
Right.
about Sergeant Pepper in the way that Fred Astaire is on the cover, right? And
Uh-huh.
like Mae West is on the cover. These are old people icons. And this is, the Beatles making their big youth statement, but they're very self-consciously and very, I think, confrontationally wanting to open it up to young people, to old people, excuse me, in a way that is challenging to young people. And
Mm.
that they had, clearly they had songs like Eleanor Rigby and, and When I'm 64 to sort of express that sympathy, but that must have been so challenging to their young radical audience at the time. I mean, this is 1967, right? The summer of love. And, this is the era of the Doors going, Father, yes, son, I want to kill you.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was very much, younger generation versus older generation. And, here, like it's Paul McCartney, but the rest of the Beatles signing on, they're putting Fred Astaire on their album cover. And, Paul always said Fred Astaire was a big influence on his songwriting, a big influence on his artistic stance. But, song like Here, There, and Everywhere, he was thinking specifically of like, Fred Astaire singing cheek to cheek,
Right.
in an old, Fred and Ginger movie. And that's, the kind of thing that you think, like that's certainly something that, certainly must have been shocking at the time. It's certainly shocking to hear that now. But that's something I love about She's Leaving Home is that sort of, that they let the old folks get their dialogue in. And me
Yeah.
personally, I always sympathize with the parents. I was always like, yeah, that's a lame way to leave home. She'll be back. She'll be back.
They should have made a sequel.
They absolutely should have.
Hopefully, I would love a sequel on that 80s album with just Star Wars sounds and just really cheesy 80s
Unbelievable. Jack,
synthesizers.
now I'm completely obsessed with this idea of this like John Lennon Star Wars. He would have done like
Yeah.
a like cantina band version of Strawberry Fields Forever kind of thing.
I
Would
think you would have loved that.
Yes, it would have been like Carnival of Light times, like Jabba the Hutt's ska band, like it would have been some like sort of interstellar sort of vaudeville. It would have been awesome. But it is, in terms of the Star Wars thing, I love that because the Beatles, that they were open to everything and they would, absolutely take the risk of humiliating themselves.
Yeah.
It's really weird that none of them were on the Muppet Show. And
Yeah.
I feel like that's something that, if the Muppet Show had kept going and the Beatles had gotten back together, I feel like that would have been, that could have been an extra Muppet movie. They would have, again, they go to Got High one night and called Jim Henson and said, we've got a great idea.
Right.
Get the Muppets together for another movie. It's got to be, we're going to return to Neverland and fight the Blue Meanies with
Right.
Gonzo and Kermit and Piggy. They were into stuff like that.
Yeah. And it would have been great too, I think.
It would have been great. And also, they'd spent the 1970s. All four of the Beatles were really weirded out that the Beatles were still so popular, right? They constantly complained about it in their interviews. Great, like mid 70s Ringo interview, like with I think it's with Ray Conley and the NME, but he's talking about the Beatles rock and roll music compilation and the way the Beatles legacy has been treated badly by the record company and everything. Like, and then the last sentence of the interview is like Ringo's like, "Oh, wait a minute! I realized like we haven't talked at all about my new record." It's such a great kicker for the interview because, of course, like it's like last. Oh yeah, I've Ringo's Rotogravure. Run out to your local record shops and buy it. It's a thing where like they found it really oppressive that the world wanted to keep talking about the Beatles. I feel like in the 80s, they all would have like made their peace with it, as the surviving ones did. Even if they had lots and lots of petty, silly, stupid drama with each other through those years. I feel like the wave of love that people had for the Beatles in a sincere, not hyped way, that they would have respected that. They were showmen enough to respect that.
I think another really fascinating thing that unfortunately never came to fruition was the fact that John Lennon, right before his death, said he wanted to re-record all of the Beatles songs to George Martin. And of course, George Martin was heartbroken by that.
Yeah.
He was like, "What do you mean?
Yes.
That's my best work."
Yes.
But John didn't think they were recorded properly, or I think he just thought that it could have been a lot better. And I don't know if that was his perfectionism or if he actually meant it. But I also would have really loved to hear like a Strawberry Fields Forever John's version,
Yeah,
to
absolutely.
Yes.
Yes. Yes, they could have gone 4 versions of the White Album where each side is another one like making it. But it's weird. Like and that's funny. Like I wonder how much of that was also him just wanting to say something to hurt George Martin's feelings.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
obviously he knew how to do very well. But it's something like it's funny that that's something that they all fled in the 70s and that they all like found really oppressive. And it was weird that they would allow themselves to be touched by it in weird ways. Something I write about in the book. I'm sure that this is a moment that you cherish too, but it's when it's when he goes back on stage with Elton John. And John Lennon has the bet with Elton John about their duet, whatever gets you through the night. And it hits #1, so John has to pay off on the bet, which is to appear to sing it with Elton John on stage at Madison Square Garden, which John is terrified of doing. And they do 2 songs, and they do they do Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds because that was another one that Elton covered, and then they do Whatever Gets You Through the Night, and then they do I Saw Her Standing There, and John says, "We want to do one more number. It's by an old estranged fiance of mine named Paul."
Yeah.
It's like so beautiful in that moment that he is so like bewildered by this wave of love that is, being bombarded at him by this, incredibly happy crowd in Madison Square Garden who just want to shower him with love. And his just gut instinct is just to share this with Paul. It's like just incredibly beautiful moment. Also,
Hmm.
nobody at that point knew who wrote which Beatles song. Like that was way before it, like most people didn't even know that Lennon and McCartney didn't write half their songs 50-50 in those days. That was something
Right.
only like sophisticates and journalists knew. Like, so
Right.
it was something that, like, for him to like say, we're going to do basically one of Paul's songs and I do this, and to invoke Paul by name, like what an incredibly weird and generous and sweet and vulnerable moment that is. And John is like, he says, he's like, I got to go backstage because I'm about to be sick. He's terrified, he's bewildered. In some ways he's mad. He's like, why is this happening for these old songs and not, like my songs on walls and bridges?
Right.
But he's just like, he's completely like in awe of this love that the Beatles have conjured up, and very, very amazing. It's kind of like his tone on the rooftop scenes and Get Back, where you could tell he's really like, and you could really see it when you're watching the movie. It's like, wow, he's really like getting out of hand. He's really carried up in the moment, and
Hmm.
like he gets happier and happier as the rooftops it goes. And when he goes over and just yells "Peace on Earth" to the people below, and
Yeah.
this is John who was like trying to sabotage things early on. Like, it's really amazing that he's like all four Beatles, something they had in common. They were in awe of this audience that they had conjured up and the love that was being bombarded at them. And they found it oppressive sometimes. They tried to escape it. They tried to deny it. They tried to put it down. But, John on stage at Madison Square Garden, Thanksgiving 1974, he's just nothing but overwhelmed by all this love coming from the crowd. And all he wants to do is share it with Paul. Just
Yeah.
unbelievably beautiful moment.
Yeah. And what's also beautiful about that is that was I believe that was the night of his reunion with Yoko
Yeah.
after they haven't seen each other in a really long
I
time.
know Yoko's backstage. It's just
Yeah.
incredibly beautiful. And as little kids, I mean, I was a little kid. I'm old enough to remember being a little kid when when John was still alive, which is a real like before and after in terms of like I remember like when John was still alive, and the idea that he and Yoko had broken up for 2 years, like this certainly this wasn't something I knew at the time. It was only when they got to back together and made jokes about it.
Right.
Our separation didn't work out, but that this was like something that brought them together was was that he was on stage being forced against his will to do these Beatles songs and this new song with, Elton John, number one Beatles fan, and just sort of admit that he was so loved, something he found so difficult to admit and accept. And it's
Yeah.
weird that that's we can see so many examples of that in Get Back. I always think of this scene. I bet you love this scene too, where Paul is playing Strawberry Fields Forever on the piano, and like John is like literally facing away from him because he doesn't want Paul to see his face, and he's just doodling on guitar. But he's like actually got his face turned away and almost buried in his lap over his guitar because he does not want Paul to see. Like, and he wants to totally pretend this is no big deal to him. And Yoko is sitting right next to him, and she's going through her green bag looking for something, like looking
Hmm.
for something. She's just like pretending to rummage through her green bag because she doesn't
Right.
want to interrupt this moment. And it's like really
Oh.
beautiful what's going on with all three of them. That Paul is playing this song. He knows it means a lot to John that he's
Hmm.
playing the song and putting his own Paul spin on it. John is like totally in denial, and Yoko is letting John hide by pretending to look for something in her green bag, which has nothing in it. She's not fooling anyone. None of them are fooling anyone. Incredibly beautiful, defenseless moment. And
Yeah.
there's so many of those that they brought out in each other and that they share with each other. And that sort of the world forced them to accept.
Yeah. I think a really another cool moment is in the 90s. I believe Paul was on tour. He was somewhere in England. I don't know if it was Liverpool or not, but he did a John Lennon tribute in concert, and he performed 3 John Lennon songs. Have you seen this?
No, I
He
haven't.
he did he
I
did
gotta check this
Help.
out.
He did like a slow ballad of Help, right in a segue into Strawberry Fields Forever, and which segues into Give Peace a Chance for like 5 minutes long, and the whole crowd is singing, and it's so cool, and it gets you so emotional because
That's beautiful.
that's just Paul just saying, "Forget about my songs," and which is something I would love to see him do in concert again, but it's like, this is my friend, and I'm gonna play his songs because I love them too. I'm a fan and I'm a friend.
I love that. I just love that. And I love how like, the world kind of forced them to accept that, whatever personal issues that they pretended, you know, like they pretended to care a lot about, but the
Yeah.
the world kind of forced them to accept how loved they were, which was really hard for them to accept, and how loved they were by the world, but also how loved they were by each other. But I love that Paul could do that, and in a way communicate more directly with John than he could have face to face. There's
Yeah.
all those like performances, really poignant performances on George's big solo tour, in 1974, which was obviously not a success, where he's doing In My Life every night, like,
Hmm.
and he's really trying to do this as his tribute to John and Paul, and like after the song, like, and it's really weird to hear like all the different bootleg versions from like each stop on the tour, and and to hear the sort of like fans like really trying to get with it, and he's really trying to sing it even though it's hard, like, and Billy Preston really like being like absolute mensch and like holding it together for the organ solo, and at the end, George always says something like, "Oh, that's for John because I love him, and Paul and Ringo, and and sometimes for the ex-wives and." Yeah, but he's always like he's acknowledging the shared history in a way that's obviously very painful for him and very difficult for
Yeah.
him physically as well as emotionally. And
Yeah.
but that was something that the world sort of forced them to accept.
Do you think that their memories of the Beatles were ruined by the media's portrayal of how the Beatles broke up?
Well, that's really interesting, and it was really interesting what George, like George was always like after the fact. George was really negative about those sessions, particularly. George was someone who was capable of like doing a lot of complaining about the Beatles after the Beatles broke up. And like John complained about those sessions after the fact. I think, it was really, I guess, moving to see how Paul and Ringo talked about those sessions and how their memories of them and their ideas of them had changed, in recent years. And sort of like also just like listening to the music. It's funny that the, that the Let It Be extended deluxe version that came out last summer, right before the movie, kind of
Right.
overshadowed by the movie in many ways. But it was something where like you could hear like they were having fun in these sessions, and I think like going back through these archives certainly like kind of made them reckon with the fact that that they were still making brilliant music together. It's funny, I don't know about you, when
Hmm.
the White Album deluxe edition was about to come out, and Paul was saying all this stuff like, like people were saying, we were fighting, but we still loved each other. We were still having fun. And I, at
Hmm.
least, I can admit, I did some internal eye rolling at that. I was like, oh, this is Paul being, like, putting you know, a good face on it, putting like a positive spin on it. Like
Yeah.
this is
Yeah.
Paul wanting to look for the bright side in that. And like, and I thought maybe he was exaggerating. And then like actually listening to those outtakes, and I'm like, holy crap, there's a version of Good Night where all four Beatles are singing
Yes. Oh my
harmony.
gosh.
And I'm like, this happened and
Yeah.
we never found out about it for 50 years.
Yeah.
That's when I was actually listening to that in Abbey Road because I was writing about that box set before it came out, and sitting, in Abbey Road, and like Giles Martin was playing it. And I just remember hearing that and just kind of staring out the window, and like my jaw was probably literally hanging open. I was like, everything I thought I knew about this era is completely wrong, which means everything I thought I knew
Yep.
about the end of the Beatles is totally wrong.
Yeah.
I mean, and it was really tough for me. I mean, especially having just written a book about the Beatles, that I was like, this completely changes, so much of that White Album stuff where they're having so much fun together. Like when there's that take of John doing Julia, just the acoustic demo, and he
Yeah.
talks to Paul, and you
Yes.
realize Paul is in the room when he's singing Julia. It
Yeah.
completely blows my mind and completely
Uh-huh.
trashes my entire worldview. I mean, something that was believed at that time, that I certainly wrote in the book, was that Julia is the only song on the White. Julia is the only song in the Beatles' whole career that's just John, no other
Hmm.
Beatles there, and Martha, My Dear is just Paul, and and he's playing the instruments, and there's the horn players. Martha is all Paul, Julia is all John. I was
Right.
like, no, actually, there were other Beatles in the room, and they recorded both those songs. At least John did the demo of Julia with Paul in the room, which is honestly shocking enough that he was able to go to that place of honesty with Paul at standing right over his shoulder, and this is late 1968 when they're supposed to hate each other, and
Yeah.
so
Supposed to.
yes,
Yeah.
so I was like, wow.
Right.
So I was like, wow, Paul, anything I thought about you putting a positive spin on things, I apologize because you were right. All this stuff was, and right up until I heard it, I thought, well, of course, Paul is going to say this. We were still having fun at that point. And
Hmm.
something about the Beatles that people really do underestimate is how close they were because, other pop groups just haven't been that close, but that they were even more close in 65 than they were previously. And they were even closer in 66 and even closer in 67 than they'd ever been. And it's completely weird that they just got closer and closer together to the point where in 66, 67, they want to spend all their free time with the other Beatles. And they just don't want to hang out with other people. As
Yeah.
John said, most other people just don't get through to us.
Yeah, I think that's really, really a beautiful fact about them. And also, the media has been trying to put a spin that the Beatles have been breaking up since like 1965. Every time the Beatles go on separate vacations, there was always a newspaper saying, "Have the Beatles broken up? John Lennon cuts his hair. Is this the end of the Beatles?" There's all those interviews of them walking into EMI Studios in December 1966, and the media reporters are like, "Is this the end of the Beatles? Are you?" And they're like, "No, no, not at all."
Do you think that in the new year that you're going to be going your own ways instead of being as a
No,
group?
no.
No?
No, George, definitely not.
What about another word?
But yeah, no, I think you're right there, and I think that's why they're everlasting, because maybe other groups only last as long as they were close to each other. And
Yeah.
for the Beatles, maybe that's why they're infinite, because they were as close as four people can get.
Yes. And also, and this is just my personal feeling, but I feel like the Beatles and their music, they gave us, the audience, the community, they gave us the emotional tools to put the band back together in a very real way. That the Beatles, because their songs are so full of emotion and that their songs are so alive and so emotional that they give us the toolkit to sort of build our own ongoing living versions of the Beatles, even after John died. And again, like even after the Beatles broke up and
Yes.
people were fantasizing about them getting it together, but the songs still allowed us to put them back together. The beautiful scene in the Richard Linklater movie Boyhood, where Ethan Hawke makes that mix for his son of like the Beatles solo songs. He's like, basically, I've put the band back together for you, and that's something that
Yeah.
all fans have done. Like we've all imagined the album the Beatles would have made in 71, the album they would have made in 73, the album they would have made in 75, and that, but because their songs tap so deeply into human feeling that those songs really make it, they really make you as a listener, they fully equip you as a listener to keep the band alive, and
Yeah.
that we as a community kept them alive after they broke up and after two of the members died. To me, that's the most fascinating and the most amazing thing about the Beatles story, which is that the audience, which in their case is the world, has kept them alive.
Even your nephew rebuilt the Beatles with the Lego set.
And his nephew will be explaining to him who the Beatles are.
Yeah.
My niece was like playing guitar, like my teenage niece taking guitar lessons. She's like, check this one out. She plays me Blackbird. I'm like, wow, yeah, great song. Yeah, this is a good one. Nobody
Yeah.
needed to sell her, and also nobody needed to explain historical significance of the song to her. She heard it. It spoke to her. It spoke to her soul.
Right.
You don't sell a teenage girl on anything. They are, like I said, they have the bullshit detector that no other audience has. That's why
Yeah.
they're the audience that you know I most deeply respect of all the pop audiences in the world. They are the ones that you just can't con. And she heard something in Blackbird that spoke to people at the time. It speaks to me. It speaks to her. And you don't need to bring any sort of historical or sociological baggage in. And it's funny that for
Right.
a long time, people thought that the Beatles were, well, you had to live through the 60s to really understand them kind of thing. And it
Hmm.
was really only in the 90s, but like all through the 80s, people said, well, we hope kids today can still understand and appreciate the Beatles. And, for those of us who were kids at the time, it was like, we actually think we get them better than you do, you know?
Yeah.
And I feel like kids now are hearing things in the Beatles on a much more sophisticated level than I am hearing. So, it's funny when I wrote this book, when you write a book about the Beatles and people are like, another book about the Beatles, and my answer and my sincere feeling is the best books about the Beatles have yet to be written. The best books about the Beatles are going to be written by people who are just hearing them for the first time now and people who are just discovering them now. I feel like it's not just that, and you can't even say that people keep rediscovering the Beatles because people keep hearing deep things in them that the audience wasn't hearing before. It's kind of like
Yeah.
how the 19th century could see things in Shakespeare that the 16th century couldn't see. And, I feel like we can read things in Shakespeare now that the 19th century couldn't see. And, certainly nobody now would say, well, if you haven't been through the Guy Fawkes plot, you can't really appreciate, the how intense King Lear is. Like nobody would say something like that. Like you have to really understand the history of the Prince of Denmark to understand, like Hamlet. Like, for the vast majority of human beings who've lived their whole lives and have connected to those stories, they don't know or care anything about the historical background of Shakespeare or the historical background of those stories.
Right.
Those are stories that just speak to our souls. And I think, the Beatles are on that same level. And, like the way Blackbird speaks, just that tune speaks to a little kid now, or speaks to an older person now, or speaks to, people from different generations, different cultures, different languages, different parts of the world, you know, different personality types. It's that's something that is weird about the Beatles and certainly beyond what they would have predicted. And
Yeah.
it's funny, like that's something that even in the 70s they were like, how is this still going on? How are
Yeah.
people still asking about songs I wrote when I was 22? Why aren't you asking about I love like when Rolling Stone was doing that interview with John in the mid 70s. And, again, they're not really asking about his new songs. And he's like,
Right.
everything I do is going to be compared with Paul. Like if I took up ballet dancing, they compare my ballet dancing to Paul's bowling. And, that's something that they learned to have a sense of humor about and accept as time went on. But, in a way, you know, the band outlived them. And I feel like they did get to see that and they did get to experience that and wonder at that and just be sort of impressed by the beautiful spiritual weirdness of that. And that's what I hear in a moment like, the moment you described, that incredibly beautiful moment of Paul doing Give Peace a Chance live for 15 minutes, or,
Yeah.
George trying and failing to sing In My Life, but dedicating it to his old friends and having Billy Preston play the organ solo. And, John doing I Saw Her Standing There on Stage for his old estranged fiance, Paul. And, all the stuff that Ringo does. Ringo is such a beautiful keeper of the legacy. I love that Ringo is like, I'm a drummer in a band. I never wanted to stand, at the front of the stage and be a front man and sing my hits for half an hour. I want to be in a band. And that's what he's
Right.
kept doing. And people made fun of him for years for doing the all-star band thing. That's like the perfect frame for what he does. That's why he's 80. He's still doing what he does as well as he ever did. He's still drumming for most of the show. When he's not drumming, he's up on his feet dancing, and he's still a phenomenal dancer.
Yeah.
Like once in my entire life, I should be in as good shape as Ringo is in now. Like once in my life, I would love to be as great a dancer as he is in his 80s. And
Yeah.
he just, he loves doing it. And that's what keeps him young and excited and passionate and enthusiastic and all those things that make him Ringo and make Paul and make them the Beatles. That he's still got that in his 80s because, he's not trying to be a front man. He's like, I want to be in a band, and that's always what I wanted to do.
Yeah. And they're so localized too, because Ringo has a giant poster of, I believe it's of him and George. They're both smoking cigars in his living room. He's got like he's a fan. And John, I think if you mentioned any of this to John, if he were around today, he wouldn't believe you, or he wouldn't want to believe you, or he'd say some kind of joke to kind of brush it off and say,
Yes.
no, that's not true. And same with George. I think George would have laughed at it.
Yes.
George even had a quote saying, like, I don't even think the Beatles were that
Totally.
good.
Yeah, he must have said that hundreds of times. And it's
Yeah.
amazing that, like, especially like something I'm kind of fascinated with George is specifically his publicity tour in 1987, where he's got this new album to sell, Cloud Nine, and he's got his game face on because he realizes he's going to be talking about the Beatles all year to sell this new album, and he's even got a song on it called "When We Was Fab." So like he's a total hypocrite on that level because he's
Yeah.
singing about the Beatles. He's like, hey, by the way, I used to be a Beatle. Check this out. Here's my song about being a Beatle. And
Right.
but every interview he's so sour about it, and he uses the word nostalgia in every single one of those interviews. And he's like, well, people care
That's
about the
right.
Beatles because it reminds them of their childhood and because of nostalgia. And it's so funny that even at that point, 1987, it's like, come on, there's a whole generation that does not remember when the Beatles existed. None of us, like by 1987, the world was full of kids like me. Like, you're probably a lot younger than I am,
Yeah.
but like 1987, the vast majority of Beatles fans already, like well over half Beatles fans at that point, do not have any memory of when the Beatles existed as a band. That is completely beside the point. Nostalgia was never part of it, you know, except for at this point just a tiny minority of Beatles fans, because like people, it does not matter when you were born. It does not matter if you remember the 60s. I mean, I love talking to Beatles fans who were there in the 60s and who have those stories because they remember all these things I don't know. And they I love hearing that perspective. But it's really funny how like that's not the last word on the Beatles. And even in 1987, when George is trying to convince himself in the world that it's just nostalgia, and even he must have known by then that it was totally wrong. But like, I wanted to quote something really funny Giles Martin said about this once when I was talking to him about the Beatles, and and what keeps them kind of fascinating. We were talking about Abbey Road when they did the amazing deluxe edition of Abbey Road a few years ago, and we were talking about how I loved that record when I was a kid, and kids love that album. It's a kid's album, and he was like, there must be some kind of dark arts with the Beatles and children, like, and he's especially Abbey Road, because they hear that and it just reaches them on some level. And he's like, as like a recording person who's like studied every detail of these tracks, I can't account for it. And he said, just on a personal level, he was like, you know obviously I don't listen to the Beatles at home because I'm working at the Beatles constantly. And,
Right.
because, I'm George Martin's son. We did not listen to that at home when I was growing up.
Right.
That was work. And, and he's like, I do not listen to that at home. And, his wife is like, also, she's like, she gets sick of that very quickly. They do not listen to the Beatles in their home. And he's like, they definitely do not play it for their two little kids. And he's like, my daughter, who was like 8 at the time, she was like, Daddy, check this out. Check out my favorite song. This is going to blow your mind. This is the greatest song. And she played for him Come Together. And like, and Giles said, he said, me and my wife, we looked at each other and we both said simultaneously, she did not hear this from me. But he was like, where did she get this? He's like, we were actually actively trying to hide the Beatles from her. He's like, that was our main goal as parents. We wanted to delay as long as possible her finding out the Beatles existed because we didn't want to hear this in our house. And and but it just got to her. The Beatles just get to people, and they get to people who a lot of people, like particularly like my generation, a lot of my Gen X generation, like people had a really sort of contemptuous attitude about the Beatles growing up because the Beatles were like the mainstream. And so for a lot of my generation, people were sort of like defining themselves against the Beatles. That sort of
Mhm.
like Steve Albini, Michael Stipe kind of like line on the Beatles, that they were just another pop group. And which is fine. Like a lot of people did great work by sort of clearing that psychic space for themselves. But it's funny that for the you know something I definitely see in a lot of friends my age who have kids, and their kids get into the Beatles, and at first they're like, huh, how is this happening? Because I wanted to get my kids into Sonny Rollins, or the Velvet Underground, or like whatever esoteric stuff they're into. They're like
Right.
hipster parents, and they're like, how come my little kid heard You Can't Do That, or Here Comes the Sun, or Yellow Submarine, and their life completely changed, and that's what they wanted to hear all day. And
Yeah.
it's really weird how like that seems to be a universal fact of parenting.
Yeah. You know what? It's I have a story that's really interesting. I used to be a preschool teacher when I was in college part-time. So when I was teaching this one class, I wore a Beatles t-shirt. So it was the Let It Be square with all four of their faces on it. And I just, it was, to me, it's just a t-shirt. It's something that I, like to show off to people, but I never expected what happened. And when I walked in the room, all of the kids, 4 years old, 3 years old, they ran over to me and they started asking me questions about who's on my shirt. And I was like, this is very otherworldly. I almost felt like it was like the Sermon on the Mount, where I'm just kind of preaching about these four great beings. To offer another story that backs up that thesis of just like I don't know if there's any way to explain why the Beatles are so magnetic to the younger generation, especially Abbey Road, and just I guess just their faces are interesting too. I don't know.
It's weird. Every aspect of that person. Also, the whole thing of like a bit like four friends who are like hanging out and like they sum up all these personality extremes just in the bond between those four friends.
Yeah,
It's weird when you think like that the friendship of, I mean, the whole concept of friendship has been around for, you know, approximately 12,000 years, like it's a fundamental part of human existence. And that
yeah,
the Beatles more than anybody embody like they're the symbol of friendship worldwide.
yes,
Used to be, I don't know, like the Three Musketeers, or like, or something like that it would have been in old times. But the Beatles are the best story about friendship, and they're a story about friendship that the world keeps telling itself. The Beatles are a story about love. They're a story about you know artistic achievement, but they're also a story about friendship and little kids attached to that. And the whole thing of like, like whether it's the Spice Girls, like in the 90s, or, Blackpink now, or, like whatever kind of pop stars they're into, like the whole thing of like having a group that you hang out with that, you're taking your stand against the world. The Beatles are just the all-time best example of that. And it's so funny that so much of the music industry now is putting bands like that together and like finding the right combination, the right, the right mix of personalities to be in a group like that together. And the Beatles just lived in the same town, the same
yeah,
totally nowhere town where there was no infrastructure to support, like a music group, becoming popular on any level at all. And the fact that, nobody could have designed a better Beatles than they did, just being those kids, just
yeah,
those raw, authentic kids finding each other. And that, the world ever since then, like every mad scientist in the music business, every Dr. Frankenstein has been in the laboratory trying to create this perfect beast of a pop band team. And
right,
yet the best one ever is just, these four nobodies who played together in a town just because nobody else wanted to listen to them. And
yeah,
it's the best story about friendship that, the world has to offer. And it's just,
yeah,
it's part of what makes them permanent. But it's, it's something, but also like the way that they outgrew that, and the way that they, and the way that they became independent artists,
hmm,
like within the confines of that group. That's part of the story as well. The sad stories of how the friendships end and how, the relationships go on. But it's funny that, like seeing in artists now who are solo artists, but who are, the world's most popular solo artists, like somebody like Drake or Taylor Swift or Harry Styles or Beyonce, that they're very much, you know, operating with the language sort of that the Beatles left behind for like a pop star to use. So they're
hmm,
always sort of, the way they all these artists, that they plant secret hints, secret stories about stories, that they have the songs comment on each other, across different albums, that they're even commenting on each other's songs, across the
hmm,
years. So like, like Taylor Swift has songs commenting on Drake songs, or commenting on Harry
yeah,
Styles songs, and like that's crazy back and forth dialogue like that the artists are having like between characters on their songs, and like all this stuff that the Beatles invented, and that this is still how, the world's biggest pop stars, this is still the perfect language, to use to, to enhance their art and to express their vision. And it's funny that even like, the album era, as the kids put it now, in my day it was an
yeah,
album cycle, now it's an album era. And
right,
it's like the whole sort of artistic stance and poise that the album stands for. And somebody
yeah,
that like that's that's what every pop star does now. Every album has to be an era. And like that's something that the Beatles invented with like,
yeah,
Rubber Soul, Revolver, Sergeant Pepper. Each album was like, a reaction against the next one and a step beyond the next one. And that, these were called concept albums. And like, this is now just like the way the way all pop stars operate, like
yeah,
nobody wants just a hit single. Nobody wants that. Even in our time now where it's like streaming, like streaming, everything's about like these fractured tracks. artists, they want albums and they want each album to be an era. They're
Yeah.
still like aspiring to this Beatles standard.
I would even go as far as saying that maybe that's why the Beatles are still around today, because they created these universes, kind of like
Totally.
Harry Potter has, characters in it. It has its own spells that don't exist inside the Marvel universe. I think the Beatles have their own universe as well, and maybe that's what other artists are. I know Taylor Swift definitely does. She has Betty, she has James, and
Absolutely. Yes. And that, and that she and Paul are obsessed with numbers in the same way they did that great like interview, like when they did a cover story of Rolling Stone a couple of years ago, artists on
yes,
artists, and it was Paul and Taylor interviewing each other. It was so funny that the first half of their conversation was about numerology, because she was like, "You just did McCartney 3 in 2020, whereas you did McCartney 2 in 1980 and McCartney 1 in 1970, and like you're just numbers." And he's like, "Well, you're the one who's like, got 13 letters and everything." And like, it's so funny
yeah,
that like, they are so exactly the same personality in so
yeah,
many ways. Like they're so much more like each other than either of them is like anybody else. And it's so funny how like that sort of style of being a pop star that the Beatles invented. But it's so funny that this is like you said, they create universes. As I always love the quote from Raekwon of the Wu-Tang Clan, like the ultimate
yes,
like '90s group in terms of like a group creating its own fictional universe where you have to learn all the different languages just to even figure out what's going on from record to record. And and Raekwon said, the Beatles are timeless dudes doing timeless things, and that we're the Black Beatles. He's like, you can call me Chef McCartney because I'm just like the Paul of our group. And
wow. Did he really say that?
yeah,
Wow,
yeah. And it's like,
that's
of course, like
awesome.
the Wu Tang Clan, like, of course, like that Beatles, like, and these are, like guys on Staten Island who are
Yeah,
like, from like the hardest part of the hood, and they're obsessed with kung fu movies and, arcane religious symbolism. And like they're doing this all like, and, the Beatles are their model. And like Ghostface has his solo album, and Raekwon has his solo album, and, Genius has his, but they're all appearing on each other's albums and sort of like commenting on like, and just like all these codes that you learn as you go deeper into this world.
yeah.
And as Raekwon said, like timeless dudes doing timeless things. But like I love how like the Wu-Tang Clan did their version of "While My Guitar Gently Weeps" with Don
Yes.
Harrison on guitar.
A raisin in the sun was amazing. The joint on the
Yes,
That's just
I
like,
love that.
It's perfect because like they took this aspect of the Beatles really further than anybody. But BTS does the same thing. You have to listen to all BTS, the world's biggest pop group, like from Korea, and like people who haven't listened to them, especially in this country, especially if they're stuck on the thing of only English language pop. But like,
Right.
they probably assume that BTS are just doing like bubblegummy dance hits. I'm like, no, actually, these guys do concept albums about Nietzsche and about Carl Jung, and you have to
Right.
like study the lyrics and the way that they sing on each other's songs and what they're saying and the dialogues that are going from album to album to even fully get a sense of what they're doing. And it's like these bands are really, you know, going to the ultimate extreme with what the Beatles invented.
I haven't listened to BTS, but now that you mentioned that, I'm actually kind of intrigued. I might give a dive into their catalog.
Yeah, it's funny that like people like like they look at them and they assume what they do from like what the way they look and the way they dance, and I'm like,
Hmm.
no, like these albums are like incomprehensible. You have to spend time on them, and there's so much going on, and it gets more fascinating like the more. But they create these like but your comparison to Harry Potter is like dead on. Like for Harry Potter to work, it has to have symbols and codes that aren't in the Marvel universe. And Marvel has to have stuff that's not in Star Wars. Like they have
Right.
to like have their own private stuff for it to compute. But the Beatles, like they're on that level in terms of myth making, and that they really like invented the way everybody does this now.
Yeah, I would have loved to see what world they would have created on that Greek island too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Paul would have been the first one to bail.
Yeah.
I think Ringo might have stuck it out longer than Paul did. But you could tell like they tried that, in India, like which really,
Yeah.
worked for like, the songs they wrote in India were so good that you're like, wow, they should have done that every now and then, just like,
Yeah.
but also that they all stayed music fans. And that's something I think they would have missed on their Greek island. Cause and that's something that they
Mhm.
still have in common, like, uh, Paul and Ringo are just like huge fans. They're always listening to stuff that's new as well as and stuff that's outside their world as well as but they're not just like sitting around listening to the records they grew up with.
Yeah. I think a couple years ago, Ringo Starr said one of his favorite songs of all time is "You Belong with Me" by Taylor Swift,
I
and
love that.
that's insane.
I love
It's
that.
so cool.
I love that. I love when Billie Eilish a couple years ago won the Grammy for Best New Artist, like, and
Yeah,
she won actually for Album of the Year, and Ringo was giving out that award. It was so sweet when Billie and her brother Phineas, like, they walk up to the stage and like they do this, like bowing down, like, to Ringo, and Ringo's just, "Well done, Billie," and he's like,
yeah,
he's so proud of her, and he gives her a big hug, and like, and I was interviewing him about that last year. I was like, it's like really funny how like, you bond with these artists, who like are so young, but they look up to you as, their model for what they want to do artistically. And like, it must be really wild for them that you even know who they are. And he's like, well, I love Miley and I love Billy. He's like, I always love the Little Rebels,
yeah.
and it's so great. I got to tell you a Ringo Zoom story, just because I'm seeing a Dylan poster behind you.
Yes,
So
absolutely.
I I've done a couple Zoom interviews with Ringo. He's a scream to interview. Phone interviews with Ringo were really different from Zoom interviews, because like, his personality is just much better suited. He really enjoys a Zoom. He's got more of an audience. Like, and the first time I made sure I hid everything like that was visible in my office that was Beatle related at all, because like I didn't want to seem like I was being that guy. So I
Right.
hid everything. And after the conversation, like, he's like, I see Bob on your wall. Is that Bob? And like, I had a Dylan album behind me. I had like Blonde on Blonde on my shelves. And I was like, yes. And he was like, oh, he's like, I didn't see anything of mine on your walls. I was like, that's because I hid it all on the floor, Ringo. They didn't want you. Here, I'll show you my Bokus of Blues LP that I've got sitting right next to the deck, because I put it all on the floor so you wouldn't freak out when you saw it. But if you want to see this,
Your bed sheets must have been like looking like a mountain or something.
yes, it was like scattered all over. I was like, yeah,
Yeah.
here's my 8-track tape of the Blue album.
That's
Like,
fantastic.
but it was just that thing of like, he's used to seeing Ringo-ness everywhere. He doesn't, it's not like, it doesn't seem like contrived or put onto him, and it doesn't seem sycophantic to him. He's just used to living in a world that has the Beatles in it, and that he and Paul have become such big Beatles fans, and that they've, shared that fandom with the world, which even like as recently as Anthology, they weren't fully capable of doing emotionally. They were still kind of, weirded out by the popularity of the Beatles.
So, speaking about the popularity of the Beatles, 100 years from now, are they going to be as popular as they once were and as they are now?
Yes, they will migrate past all the media. The way that, like maybe 100 years ago, people were like, well, will people still care about Shakespeare when they can see these new moving pictures that they have down at the Nickelodeon? And like, then when, talkies became soundies, it's like, oh, not a sound motion pictures. Like, certainly, like, people would look into the future and see like, okay, there's going to be movies, there's going to be TV, there's going to be DVDs, there's going to be VHS tapes, there's going to be cable TV, there's going to be streaming. People are going to be binging hours and hours of TV on their couches without even having to get up to, to touch a remote control, let alone like touch the TV. All these, different formats are going to be invented for telling stories in a visual medium. But it's not going to hurt Shakespeare any. He's not getting any less famous. None of this is going to interfere with the world's appreciation of Shakespeare. It's going to make Shakespeare bigger in every generation. It's going to make him mean more in every generation, because he is going to translate to these stories. There's a great quote from Raymond Chandler in it's from a late interview, and it's, I know this quote because it's quoted by Greil Marcus in his classic Mystery Train, one of the best books ever. But he's like, Shakespeare would not have looked at these, modern formats like the movies or like the pulp novel, the screenplay. He wouldn't have looked at them and said, these are not good. He would have looked at them and he would have made them good, the way he did for the theater, because the theater was really, decrepit, low prestige, low paying, low class, like it was street pop entertainment for the groundlings, like in the time that Shakespeare did it. Popular theater was just like mass entertainment, and Shakespeare was in it to make money. He was a showman, he was a hustler. And that he chose that medium to tell stories, and that his language, his stories, everything about Shakespeare just translates to every medium that comes along ever since then. right up to the Beatles, like incorporating Shakespeare into so many of their songs. I Am the Walrus just being like maybe the most famous example, just because like everybody else, I have that scene from King Lear memorized, just because it's at the end of I Am the Walrus.
Oh, slave, thou hast slain me. Give the letters which thou find'st about me to Edmund, Earl of Gloucester.
Is he dead?
Sit you down, father. Rest you.
Like, again, a very Star Wars type thing. Like, this definitely proves your Star Wars theory that John was just like listening to like this BBC broadcast one night. He was like, I could record this and then put it on the end of like my song.
Yeah.
So like this one BBC play of King Lear is like in one of the most famous songs of the 20th century. But I feel like, yes, the Beatles will still be thriving in these formats in much the way that Shakespeare is. And in my book, Dreaming the Beatles, I'm talking about stuff that has, migrated through time that way. And it's very difficult to predict. But like Oscar Wilde is an example I use. Oscar Wilde died, 120 years ago. He's much more famous now than he was in his lifetime. And he was world famous in his lifetime. He was one of the most famous men in England in his lifetime. And he was famous and scandalous and ultimately like despised and imprisoned and persecuted in these really horrible ways. But like, imagine like, and I feel part of me as an Oscar Wilde fan, I feel like he always knew that in the future, he would be more famous 120 years later after his death than he was in his lifetime. And, he was writing plays 150 years ago, but, Oscar Wilde is as alive as a character as he's ever been, and that he's known to more people. He means more. He's more loved to people on a deeper level than ever before. Alice in Wonderland, I feel the same way. It's from a similar time frame. Every little kid, especially every little girl, like Alice in Wonderland is just a ongoing myth. It's, whatever kind of historicism you might try to impose on it, it's particular to like Victorian childhoods or something like that. It's like, it just, it survives everything. Jane Austen is like that. Annie is like that. Annie is one from like my lifetime. I was a little kid when Annie was a play that little kids loved. And it made sense that we loved Annie because it was a new play for little kids. It was a little girls musical that was little girls singing to other little girls. And it was little girls playing other little girls, singing to other little girls in the story, but also singing to the girls in the audience. And, and Annie, it must have seemed in the 80s like it was weird that Annie was still so popular in the 80s, being left over from the 70s. But like Annie it's huge now on a level that like Annie is much, much, much more popular with little kids now than it was when I was a little kid. And the way that the story Annie survives so many different kinds of tellings. That great Black Annie from a few years ago, like I feel like that was, like a great, like just another case of the Annie phenomenon just expanding and evolving. And certainly nobody involved with Annie thought that people would still care about this 50 years later. I refuse to believe that. Absolutely no way.
And even Jay-Z sampled Hard Knock Life.
Yes, and it was brilliant.
Yeah.
And I remember hearing that for the first time. I was in the car and I practically smashed into a telephone pole. I was like, now I've heard everything. This is, like, and he's sampling Annie to be down. This is not a pop move. This is like, this is how bad he is that he can sample Annie, and it's straight from the hood to the hood. And, and it's really wild that like, Annie's a good example of that. Like there are, Sherlock Holmes is a great example. Sherlock Holmes, a character that when you read the Sherlock Holmes stories, he's very much from a particular time and place. He's very much a guy from like Victoria's era. He's a Victorian era Londoner. He's not even like, he doesn't really translate outside London. He's very much a London only kind of guy. And he's very much from that time period. He's very provincial in many ways in terms of time and space. But however, everybody still loves Sherlock Holmes. He's still the detective. When you're thinking about things logically and solving any kind of mystery, whether it's emotional or personal or sexual or whatever it is, or if it's criminal, you're still being Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah.
And that franchise has so many different types of telling, like, whether it's the Lucy Liu one or the Benedict Cumberbatch one, like there's, that story, it keeps expanding. And I love stories like that. That's my favorite thing in writing about music and writing about history and writing about culture is these stories that just keep telling themselves. Arthur Conan Doyle dies, the world does not care. Everybody goes on loving Sherlock Holmes, and we tell those stories to each other and we tell them to ourselves. We adapt them. Gene Roddenberry passes away. Star Trek just keeps expanding. That 5-year mission, it's going to be a 5,000-year mission by the time it's done.
Yeah.
Star Wars, George Lucas, God bless him. I hope he lives another 100 years, but like that story will outlive him.
Yeah.
Francis Ford Coppola just did that amazing interview talking about all his plans for the future. He's still making new movies. Love that beautiful old madman. He's he's at an advanced age right now, but like The Godfather will absolutely go on. That's a story that
Yeah.
people will keep telling. People still keep using their own voices to tell their own stories in The Godfather and through The Godfather, the way that they do with the Beatles, but the way that they do with Romeo and Juliet, the way that they do with David and Goliath. Like these are stories that are just, they're good stories, and some stuff is just built better. A story mentioned in the book, like I don't know if this is something you can relate to from your preschool teaching days, but when I was teaching English at the University of Virginia, when I was like grad school, and I was teaching Jane Austen, and I walked into the class just, I liked Jane Austen. Who didn't like Jane Austen? Teaching Pride and Prejudice, I was like, Jesus, this is so good. And it blew my mind how the students completely flipped for it. Most of them clearly never read it before, and they wanted to argue about it constantly. Like I tried to pimp them on the Prelude and Wordsworth. They did not care about Wordsworth. They did not care about Spenser and the Fairy Queen. Not the way I wanted them to. Like they appreciated these things. They wrote brilliantly about them. But it was wild that like Jane Austen was like nothing else. And I was like, wow, this is like the Beatles or something. It's just built better. And
Yeah.
some stuff, it's of its time. Other music from the Beatles era, like Motown, same thing. It's universal, it's permanent. We're going to be listening to those Motown songs 5,000 years from now. Whatever music is, whatever formats, whatever languages and cultures as yet unimaginable, they're going to have some version of the stories the way that we have, David and Goliath and Romeo and Juliet, Bonnie and Clyde, Biggie and Tupac. These are just, good stories.
And John and Yoko.
John and Yoko. And I feel like that's another story that, people, we feel like we know this story, so glad we still have Yoko with us. And I hope she keeps going on because she still has so much to give. And I feel like we're all going to spend years and decades sort of catching up with the weirdness of this story. There's so much about John and Yoko that people don't know, even though they were like the world's most famous couple for most of their lives together. Like I feel like people still don't know how famous Yoko was before she got with John. That's something Yoko and Linda have in common. People, they don't realize that Linda McCartney was one of the top photographers in the music world, and that she was hugely famous independently in her own world before she ever met any of the Beatles. And Yoko, she was collaborating with Ornette Coleman and John Cage and Lamonte Young. She was like absolutely like top level prestige classical music artist. And I was someone who like thought of her as like visual artist, kind of a dilettante who like attached herself to these, cultural and creative outlets that she was exploring, experimenting with John. But, like even I didn't realize, what kind of, credentials she and Linda both walked into that scene with. Patty Boyd, she was the one who found out and told them about the Maharishi,
Yeah.
She was the one who was into, Eastern religion, Indian mythology. She was into, Indian literature. And she was the one who told George, I'm going to this lecture by this guy I'm really into, the Maharishi. Maybe you should come. And George tells the other Beatles about it. And of course, all 4 of them come that night, and they bring Mick Jagger and Marianne Faithfull. And the next day they get on a train totally randomly to go to Wales to join the Maharishi for the weekend. Like what a completely bizarre thing. It all comes down to Patty. People don't give Patty Boyd credit for that. That's like Patty Boyd's spiritual and intellectual interests, and that the other Beatles were open to that, like they were like, yeah, okay, this is a writer. Basically that's who he was to like Patty Boyd. She never heard him speak before. She knew his books. And the Beatles were like, this is a writer that Patty Boyd is really into, let's go check it out. That they had that level. They were on that level where they were so interested in, the women in their lives and their intellectual interests in a way that, the Stones certainly were not. I'm sorry. Mick Jagger, he was not like going to hear lectures because, because Shirley Watts thought that this guy was like a really interesting
Yeah.
philosopher. Like
Instead, he was just going through her wardrobe and trying on her clothes.
yes, exactly,
Right.
exactly. Like Pete Townsend was, like not going to see lectures because Peg Entwistle said it was a good idea. I don't know. Peg Entwistle was John Whistle's wife. I'm just picking that out of the way, out of
Right.
the air. But there's like, this level of that the Beatles operated in, where they were so like in tune with each other's ideas, so curious, and that that these women that they brought into their orbit, were women who had their own intellects, their own ideas, their own perspectives. I mean, to me, like one of the mind-blowing things about the Beatles Go to India story is that, this is Patty Boyd's idea. It all comes from like her being interested in this writer, and the other Beatles taking her seriously as a thinker and as a reader enough to go to this lecture. And I mean, that says a lot about the respect that they had for Patty, the respect that they had for George, but also just the respect that they had for the women in their lives and in their scenes. It's really
Yeah.
remarkable. And like Paul learning about all this classical music stuff from Jane Asher and never trying to hide that. He's like all
Oh, I
this,
didn't know that.
but like, his whole thing with like, and his going to, the Indica Art Gallery because that was,
Yeah, of course.
that was his girlfriend's brother. And, that he was like, she was the one who was taking him to classical music, taking him to the opera. And, he was like, Jane is teaching me all this stuff and I want to know. That great quote that he gave to Maureen Cleave in 66, I vaguely resent anybody knowing anything that I don't know. It's one of my favorite Paul lines ever. It sums him up so perfectly. And that he still feels that way at 80. He's still like Phoebe Bridgers. Yes, I love Phoebe Bridgers. Like
Yeah.
I completely love that. He's,
Yeah.
like he's still got that attitude. And I love that. People say it's arrogant, but that's, so much of what we know is from Paul McCartney wanting to know all that stuff. And the Beatles were like totally open about like wanting to learn from the women in their lives, the adult women in their lives. That Yoko and Linda, they both had divorces and marriages and children that they walked into the relationship. Certainly like very different from the kind of thing that other male rock stars of their generation like were just not interested in or capable of. Coupling up with women like on their same level. And the Beatles, I mean, for me, that the Beatles learned about the Maharishi from Patty, that's a whole realm of the Beatles story that we're just beginning to catch up with.
Yes, and I hope that people aren't still thinking of Patty Boyd as just George Harrison and Eric Clapton's muse, because she deserves a lot more credit for her own intellectual pursuits. And, that's just another thing that the Beatles were just so ahead of their own time with.
Yes, and that they were, looking for new models of being an adult, new models of being a man. But I always think like it's such a tiny detail of the famous Beatles in India story, but like, just the whole thing that all four of the Beatles were like, yeah, we should do this because like Patty likes this guy's book. That's that says a lot about Patty. It says a lot about the Beatles, and it says a lot about that they were operating in this like very ahead of their time milieu. I mean, obviously, like like John had a lot of misogyny that he wanted to confront in public. Like he was a long way from being able to confront that in public. Mm-hmm. But like, it still blows my mind that this is something that all the Beatles did as a group project because it was Patty Boyd's, it was a lecture she was going to.
Speaking of women, do you see Paul McCartney collaborating with Taylor Swift in the future?
Absolutely. To the extent that it's, weird that they haven't done it so far. Like, I guess they're just so busy. I mean, maybe they've done it and they just haven't told us about it. It would be very in character for them to, maybe at midnight tonight, they'll be like, oh, by the way, we have an album, like it would be very typical for them to do that. So, we should say as far as we know, like they've enjoyed making music together. They have played together, in occasions they've done. I saw her standing there. Dave Grohl has that great story about like being at Paul McCartney's house with Taylor Swift. And like Dave Grohl was like so stoned that like he like couldn't play the piano and Paul challenged him to. And he's like, Taylor Swift was the only one there who wasn't like completely stoned out of her mind. So like she goes over and starts playing the piano and he's like, Taylor Swift just totally saved me from like looking like an idiot in front of Paul. He said Taylor Swift was like Batman. She just came to my rescue. I love that. But that the Beatles, like that they created this language that translates to pop artists from all these different worlds and all these different cultures and all these different generations. I think this is partly why, like people are still going to be using this language in 100 years and in 1,000 years. Shakespeare,
Yeah.
people write plays because that's what Shakespeare wrote,
Right.
like
Yeah.
plays became a thing because Shakespeare and the theater took off as a public entertainment in his era. And there are a lot of like other greats doing it at the time that he did, like Marlowe and Kidd and like Ben Jonson, all those guys. And
Yeah.
but none of them were Shakespeare. And and to a large extent, the theater as we know it exists because Shakespeare, that was the format he chose to express himself in. And I feel like,
Right.
songs are the same way. Certainly rock and roll, I feel like now it's the music that's famous because it's what the Beatles did.
Exactly. And, even to the same point where music journalism is going to go on because of what you're contributing to Rolling Stone now and of what Angie's contributing to Rolling Stone. And I just think that's really cool.
Well, and some of the stuff that you're doing with this, this amazing
Yeah.
podcast that didn't exist, until now. And, now like for Beatles fans, it's funny that like for Beatles fans listening to something like your podcast is something, it's a resource that we didn't have 10 years ago. And now it's like, boy, like, I feel like as a Beatle fan now, it's weird to look back on 10 years ago and go like, God, we had it rough back then. Man, we was
Yeah.
lonely, like
Right.
it's sort of the way Deadheads are always like talking about the era, like the era when I was young, when like people listened to the official studio albums and the official live albums, because
Yeah.
that's what
Europe
you could hear.
72.
And maybe a few tapes. If you had tapes were still a really, insider thing. You had to know somebody who had a tape. And like most people who had a tape had a few tapes. But like it, it's now it's like kind of funny that anybody like listened to the Grateful Dead studio albums because they were such a big fan. But
Right.
they, now that seems like such an impoverished time. I feel like
Yeah.
it's what it is now to be a Beatles fan. Like imagine like when all you could do is watch Anthology on VHS and
Yeah.
and listen to the studio albums and you couldn't like listen to your podcast while watching hour 13 of Get Back.
Right.
But like even like something like Get Back, it's so full of like Get Back is something, it's so long and yet it's got so much stuff that we will be unpacking. I mean, I don't know how many times you've watched it, probably more times than me, but I've watched it a lot of times by now. And I'm constantly noticing stuff and I'm like, even if just this scene was the only part to go public, but like, can you imagine like something like the scene where just, Linda's coming into Abbey Road, like not Abbey Road, Twickenham Studios, obviously. And like
Right.
Paul's introducing her to the crew and he's like, oh, this is Tony. Tony's a cameraman. He's like, oh, Linda's a cameraman too. And like,
Yeah.
imagine in the 90s, if that, if somebody dug up that clip and we saw it on MTV, that would have blown people's minds.
Yeah.
Like, that like Paul was like progressive on that level and just, introducing Linda on that level, in terms of her accomplishments as a photographer,
Yeah.
like, which were largely forgotten in the 90s and certainly are forgotten now. But
Right.
it's wild that even something like that would have made such a sensation. And that's just, 10 seconds in this like 8-hour feast. We're going to be unpacking that for years to come.
I even remember in like 2008 or 2009, there was like breaking news on TV. I think it was ABC or NBC, and they literally had a half-hour special, and then the headline was like, breaking news, the Beatles' Lady Madonna music video was not actually the Beatles recording the song Lady Madonna. And it was like when the whole thing came out where like they were actually recording Hey Bulldog, but they put the footage to the song Lady Madonna for the music video. And it's like looking back now, it's like just wait 10 years
Yes.
and see the kind of breaking news you're going to get.
Absolutely. Well, and it's funny, like, it's funny for me as a Beatles fan to like look back on some of the documents that I clung to. Like I look at, bootleg VHS tapes where I paid like $20 to see something like the I Feel Fine chocolate commercial. They did an ad for some chocolates where they're sitting on the floor eating chocolate to like I Feel Fine. And I was like, just seeing that was like such a, I can't believe this exists. I have
Yeah.
made contact, like I'm the ape in 2001 touching the monolith, like
Yeah.
it's like now like that's, like stuff like that is out there in a way that it wasn't before. I love like that story, but even stuff like an anthology, like I remember something I remember in Anthology, and I was like, an adult Beatle fan when Anthology came out and hearing like John actually saying, like, those of you in the cheaper seats, clap your hands. The rest of you
Yeah.
rattle your jewelry. And I was like, I'd read those words millions of times, but I was like, I can't believe I'm hearing John's voice saying this. It was
Yeah.
so bizarre. It was like, I had never expected that. I was like, somebody had this tape and it was just sitting in a vault somewhere. And somebody, and that's like, one scene in Anthem. And of course, like everybody now, like that's, it's, fairly famous Beatle moment, but like nobody, it's weird now to go back and think like, wow, for like my first 25 years as a Beatle fan, it had never occurred to me that I would get to hear him say that. These are
Yeah.
words that we read and we pictured John saying them many times. But, stuff that we used to like, the kind of bootlegs that we would like, line up. It's like, hey, there's this store. I can say the name of the store because it's closed. It's Second Coming in Cambridge. And it was a store right next to Boston. Like it was Cambridge. I had a job like right down the street. And I would go after work and they would have these imports, quote unquote. They were not imports, they were bootlegs. And it was fantastic. It was around for years until representatives of the law, I believe, took an interest, allegedly. Like but it's not there anymore. But it was such a resource because you could find these like Beatle bootlegs. I would buy like the Beatles at the Beeb series, which is like the Beatles like just on the radio, and they're just messing around. It's like the stuff on the Beatles in the BBC compilation, which is amazing.
Right.
But that's like a 2 CD like culled from it. These are just the Beatles, like just their like verbatim radio shows, and they're just like messing around and like dedicating songs to their aunties out there in Radioland. And I was like, I can't believe I get to hear this. What a planet, And even that this stuff was there, and like now, like this stuff is so accessible, to those of us who, like we had to go to the ends of the earth to find this stuff, and it's really beautiful that this stuff is like accessible now.
Whenever I hear Beatles rarities like interviews or outtakes or radio shows, as you were saying, it always gives me like kind of a second wind. It just takes me right back to my childhood and growing up with these four friends, and it's always just so incredible being able to discover this stuff.
Absolutely. And that like all this stuff, and that they're still finding more, like
Yeah.
honestly, like I have to say a real like before and after my life as a Beatle fan is the Sgt. Pepper box of the 50th anniversary edition. They didn't call it 50th anniversary edition, but it's the deluxe edition where they put like all these outtakes. And I went to Abbey Road to hear it. It was kind of like a sudden thing. And I walked into Abbey Road fully confident that it was going to be like a bunch of barrel scrapings. I was like, man, like this stuff wasn't even good enough to put in an anthology. Like,
Right.
imagine they're really scraping it this time. And I was excited to hear it, but I was like,
Yeah.
I thought it was going to be just, trivial footnotes to like music I already knew.
Right.
And it was so shocking, just absolutely shocking to me to sit there. And, I went in, met Giles, and like Giles wanted to play his remix. And I was like, actually, before the remix, like, can we hear some of the outtakes? And he was like, oh, okay. And he pressed the buzzer. He was like, could you bring the other tape? Rob's a pervert who just wants to hear outtakes. And all this stuff was just there. And I was like, this was in a vault for 50 years. And this was in a vault for 50 years. And it was like, it was amusing to him that like, because like nobody had heard this stuff except like the people who were working on this project. Even the people at EMI hadn't heard this yet. And, and he was like, wow, like, he's like, really? This is a big deal? I was like, this is insane. And,
Wow.
And to hear like all those variant takes where they're doing the different versions of the chord of, the final chord at the end of A Day in the Life.
Yeah.
Just incredible. But also like something like, there's this thing on the Sgt. Pepper thing where it's just Paul and George in the booth and they're talking over Penny Lane because they've been doing like backup vocals for Penny Lane. And they're just like talking back and forth and they're like, oh, that's pretty good. And they're doing like, sort of like, they're just kind of snapping their fingers and humming along with it. They're just like listening to the playback.
Yeah.
And it's just like 2 minutes of them like talking over the song that they've recorded. And they're going like, yeah, this is pretty good. This is pretty fun. Like, and they're like, oh, we'll put backwards guitar in this part. And they're making jokes. They're really proud of what they've done. They're really confident. They're really excited. Like, it's like, oh my God, like imagine like that we can listen to this now. And it must have seemed so weird to them, the idea that people would listen to this 50 years later. Certainly not something they planned on. So, they probably didn't know it was being recorded. They EMI wasn't throwing anything away at that point, but they had no way of knowing that. I'm sure they didn't
Right.
care. It never occurred to them that people would be listening to this conversation 50 years later, like, and not just like listening once and they're like, oh, this is a curious outtake sort of way. Like, I listened to that so much. It's
Yeah.
so much. And you listen to Paul and George listening to the song that they've just created, and they're so excited about it. They're fans. And for a minute, they're letting themselves be really blown away by this magic they've created. And there's something beautiful and innocent and boyish about it, but also something so arrogant and confident about it. I love the like both sides of it. They're both like total egomaniacs who are like, we
Yeah.
are geniuses. I can't believe we did this. But also they're like little kids going like, God, this is so good. Music is so transformational.
Yeah.
And this is just 2 minutes of throwaway conversation that they never intended anybody to hear. I listen to this at least once a week, Jack. This is like
Wow.
part of my life, and like,
Yeah.
so to me, that was real before. I was like, the fact that there was so much new stuff in the vaults, it didn't just shock me, I guess, that I had to accept that there was all this new stuff that none of us had heard, but it also was like real, like, revelation that there's so many more new stories in this music that we're just going to keep unpacking, and that, our grandchildren are going to be explaining to us, like when little kids who are not born now, but like eventually one of those kids is going to say like, no, like what you don't realize about Penny Lane is, and they're going to hear this like cosmic connection with like, other music made by the Beatles or made by other people. But, like it's going to be like, on a level that we can't even fathom. And it might be in a language that we have, that the world hasn't learned to speak yet. But like that this is an ongoing story that the world is going to keep telling itself, and that we're going to keep telling each other, and that, the story is going to outlive any of us. We're all going to die with the story still going on. And there's something really beautiful about that.
Oh, 100%. I completely agree with you, Rob. And I'm sometimes I love to listen to the studio chatter, and I honestly think that sometimes it's as good as the song itself.
Unbelievable. Yeah. It's the White Album stuff. That was just like completely insane. And I was not at all prepared.
Yeah,
for,
exactly.
Like, and like, I'd love the Esher demos for a long time. That was something that
Yeah.
I found at Second Coming in Cambridge. R.I.P. to one of the great record stores of my entire formative experience as a fan. But it was a place like that. Something like the outtake, the Esher demos. They're just like kicking around at George's place, and you can hear how casual they are. And it's such a different, like, and so many of those versions are so much better than the versions on the White Album. You're like, wow, Honey Pie, they're all just like sitting around in like George's beanbag chairs, smoking his joss sticks, and they're like, having, Mal make the tea. And they're just banging this song out just to get it on tape. And they're going to spend months in the studio trying to make it sound as good as this. And they're never going to get close. Like, and I love like the Esher demos. Also, until I heard those demos, I thought they were the Esher demos, like everybody called them that way.
Yeah.
It was one of the engineers at Abbey Road. Like, it was like, I was like, you keep calling them Esher. Like, have I been pronouncing it wrong all my life? And he's like, yeah. He's like, don't worry. Nobody knows this. And yet another story the world has yet to learn. Most fans hadn't even heard the Esher demos at that point. And that's something now that's, such a huge part of the White Album story. But now, like, like you don't have to be a snob or an expert or a collector to hear that stuff.
Right.
Anybody can hear it. And it's like, it's beautiful that that's part of the story of the music. But, I'd still never heard stuff like, John doing Julia, and saying like, Paul, what do you think of this one? And I'm like, well, that completely changes everything I thought about John and Paul's relationship. And, and the beautiful outtake where he's playing it for George Martin, and he's really bashful about playing a song that personal for George Martin. Yeah. He's like, it's really hard to sing this song, And George Martin very kindly says, well, it's a very difficult song to play, John.
It's very hard to sing this,
It's a very hard song, John.
Yeah.
Really like get such a vivid sense of like, George Martin and how selflessly he made it possible for them to do this stuff. Like on the level that, like he wasn't getting credit for at the time and had no way of knowing that like future generations would revere him the way he did for this stuff that, like he wasn't even getting paid for,
Yeah. Yeah.
And that, so many of the people in this story who like felt unappreciated in their time, Jeff Emmerich sadly felt kind of bitter at the end of his life. Like if he only knew like how wide open his future is, like the biggest Jeff Emmerich fans in the world haven't even been born yet. He's just part of the story of this music that's just going to get bigger. And I feel like so much of this story, there's so much wonderful past that's in this story that we're unpacking. But I feel like the really scary and inspiring, but also intimidating thing about this music is how much future is in it, because
Yeah.
we don't know what forms this story is going to take, but it's going to keep going on.
And as this material continues to be released, you obviously play a huge role in introducing it to the public through your work and your writing. Do you see yourself continuing to write extensive reviews about this new material from the Beatles?
I sure will, even if, by then nobody's reading them and I'm just, like 50 years from now when I'm in my nursing home, I'm going to be tracing on my wallpaper, nobody will be reading what I'm writing. I'm just going to be writing in the dust on my lampshade. But, I feel like, you too, I feel like all Beatle fans are like this. Like,
Yeah.
Something about the Beatles, we hear our story in their story, right? We hear our feelings in their music. We hear our lives in their music. We have no idea how people fell in love before the Beatles songs taught us how to do it. We have no idea how people felt sad and self-pitying until the Beatles taught us to do it in their music. Like, those songs are just part of our emotional language that we don't even, we don't even think about life without. And I feel like, as those stories keep going, we're just going to keep hearing, more in this music and also like more in this story. And I feel like, I, as, just one of many, witnesses and storytellers in this, I'm just a fan who just, I love these late night Beatles arguments with my friends, and I just want to keep them going. And, I guess just, I guess I would hope that I'm passing it on, but that's something, I guess that as Keith Richards once said, the epitaph for every musician, should be, he passed it on, or she passed it on, or they passed it on. But like, that's all they want to do, it's like they heard something they loved that told them who they were as a human being, and they just wanted to pass that on to other people. And for someone like Keith Richards, it's a very archival thing. He sees himself as passing on the blues tradition to like future generations, which he has done and will continue to do long after he's gone, but which will never happen. But I feel like, passing it on is really, it's, you with your podcast, me with my books, that's all we want to do is just like pass this on to other people who love this stuff as much as we do. And, they will pass it on and they will have their own stories to add to it.
And are you working on any projects at the moment?
I'm working on everything now. Oh my God. I'm always writing too many books at the same time. That's my curse. Like, as a writer, like, yeah. So yes. So I'm working on and hoping to be like, yes, working on is that's the way I'll put it right now. I'm working on too many books and yes, working on them, but they're exciting, because when you write about music and it's something that, for like, you with your podcast or like, like, and anybody who is like fascinated with music and the stories that go into it and the stories that go into listening to it, people's stories about listening to being in the Beatles are, as fun as stories about being in the Beatles for me. And to me, like these living in these stories is, it's something that, it's inspiring and it keeps me, enthusiastic for more. That's always inspiring to me. So I always want to hear more of these stories. And, because of like, like artists like you working in the medium that you're working in, we have more access to more stories and more perspectives. I mean, I learn more about the Beatles every year. I learn more about the Beatles every week than I used to in a year, because like there's so many ways for people to tell their stories about the Beatles now. And, whether it's, like we were talking about, teenage fan bloggers who are like teenage girls who are like posting about the Beatles in a, stan perspective, who, are doing insane amounts of research to tell the stories of these Beatles stories that are unknown to even longtime fans like me.
Right.
Everybody, that's something about the Beatles is that it's a story that we love to keep telling and that we love to keep passing on. And everybody tells it, puts their own different version of it out there. Kind of just like the Beatles thought they were doing with Chuck Berry and, Ray Charles, like, and Buddy Holly and Carole King and Smokey Robinson. They were just, they're just trying to do their own version of this. Like, only in their wildest dreams did they think of being as good as Chuck Berry or Carole King or Smokey Robinson or Smokey or Buddy Holly or Elvis. Like they just wanted to, do their version of it and put that into the world.
Yeah.
And that's something that's so beautiful about their versions. Like when they do a Smokey Robinson song, they're not trying to sing as beautifully as Smokey Robinson because they can't, because nobody in the history of the planet has ever been able to. But that, they're telling their version as Chuck Berry fans what their version of the Chuck Berry story is. And they're just putting that out into the world. It became part of the Chuck Berry story, and it became the Beatles story. And that's something, we're all doing with the Beatles. We're all hearing some version of ourselves in the story and putting that out there in every medium that artists are working in.
Yeah, it's kind of like the fans are like the gasoline for the cars that will transport these artists way into the future, to give you like a really bad metaphor.
The future that will have neither cars nor gasoline.
Yeah.
The whatever space trains that the kids will be riding by the time they hear this. But yet some kind of like, it's weird how the Beatles story, something that's almost universal about the Beatles story, it makes whoever it touches, makes them want to tell their story, whatever that is, right? So like, think about the Sex Pistols, who made such a shtick out of hating the Beatles. And like, that was part of their thing. They made such a grand joke out of hearing the Beatles. They heard the Beatles and they heard their story, and they wanted to tell their version of the story, which is, we are young English kids. We are really bored and betrayed and disappointed by this England that we're born into. So we hate the Beatles. And that became like such a beautiful story in itself that has inspired so many people. It's amazing that that's something about the Beatles that's, like, I hate to keep comparing them to Shakespeare. And I made when I was writing this book, I made my editor promise that I would keep the Shakespeare comparisons down to a minimum, because they sound ridiculous and pompous even when they're true, which they often are. But people, as Harold Bloom said about Shakespeare, like people as a culture, as a civilization, learned to listen to themselves by reading Shakespeare and by seeing Shakespeare plays, by hearing those characters communicate with themselves. And that, his grand statement is that's how Shakespeare invented what we now think of as humanity, is that like that kind of introspection that his characters have. That I feel like the Beatles, it's a similar thing. Like, what keeps them going on and will keep them going on, and we're only at the beginning of the Beatles story at this point, that almost anybody who's touched by the Beatles hears their own story and it makes them think, hey, I've got a story too. And so certainly, like, for the Beatles writing, songs like Please Please Me and Love Me Do, and these really like, relatively shabby areas of Liverpool, in the late 1950s, early 1960s, and, they certainly didn't envision a future where, a poor blind black kid in Detroit, born to unbelievable poverty, like way beyond anything even Ringo knew, named Steveland Morris, is going to learn to play a lot of instruments, even though he's blind, and he's going to hear the Beatles, and he's going to say, he's going to be a proficient, like, Ray Charles imitator. That's basically his professional gig, is little Stevie Wonder. But like, he's going to hear the Beatles. He's going to say, I want to write songs like that. And he's going to record Beatles songs, but then he's going to write his own Beatles songs. Don't You Worry About a Thing, and You Are the Sunshine of My Life. They are as great Paul songs as anything Paul wrote in the 70s. And Paul would be the first one to say so. Paul ended up, like, doing collaborations with Stevie Wonder on and off for the rest of both their careers. That the Beatles, they could not have imagined that Stevie Wonder was out there, this like incredibly like poor, scared, blind, like kid who the world was definitely out to crush. Stevie Wonder, born into a hostile world that did not want him to exist. And he became an artist in large part listening to the Beatles. And that, like lots of like other, something like, Sylvester, like gay drag queen, disco diva genius in San Francisco in the 70s, here's Blackbird, and like decides Blackbird is a song about him and a song about being gay in the 70s and coming out. We were only waiting for this moment to rise, and turns it into this African-American queer pride anthem. And like on stage in San Francisco, Sylvester's doing this disco version of Blackbird, and he's got Martha Wash and Evora Rhodes singing background. They later became the Weather Girls, but very famous like soul singers in their own right. And like, these are like, Black artists who the world wanted very much to ignore and who were never supposed to become famous artists. But like, they're doing Blackbird, and for them, it's their story and it's their audience's story. And they're passing that on to the audience in that way. The first time I heard Sylvester's version of Blackbird, I was like, this is astounding, because it sounds nothing like the original. And he's taking the story somewhere totally new, and he's making it his in a way that sums up this historical moment. And he's singing it to this audience. It's 1979 in San Francisco. And they're like, yes, this is our moment. We were only waiting for this moment to arise. And I feel like even now hearing that is such an inspiring and audacious way to transpose the Beatles' music. I think about the
Yeah.
Wu-Tang Clan, growing up as, like the poorest of the poor, ghetto kids in the hood in Staten Island. Even the rest of New York doesn't care about them,
Yeah.
and they're making hip hop in Staten Island, which,
Yeah.
could not matter less in the rest of the city. And yet
Yeah.
they're, they're taking inspiration from chess, from, religion, from esoteric mythology, from kung fu movies.
Shaolin shadow boxing and the Wu-Tang sword style.
On guard. I'll let you try my Wu-Tang style.
But also they're listening to the Beatles. That's part of what they're
Right.
doing. They're taking inspiration from everywhere. All these artists I've mentioned have. But to me, it's amazing that all these different artists who in many ways have nothing in common, but all over the world, they hear the Beatles and they're like, yes, my story, which is nothing like the Beatles. I'm forgetting the name of the director who just did Drive My Car. I'm sorry, I can't remember his name, but he, the way he said, the Beatles inspired him to tell his story with this really dark, dramatic Japanese film that has nothing to do with the Beatles. Or you think of Murakami's novels, all these artists in all these different forms, they have nothing in common with each other except they heard the Beatles and that made them think that their story should be told. And that's what the Beatles do to us and will keep doing to us. We hear the Beatles and the Beatles story. We love the Beatles story, but what makes it mean something is that people around the world, we hear the Beatles and it tells us what our story is. And it tells us to go out there and tell our story.
Yeah. And I hope these episodes can help people do that as well.
You are doing, you are telling the stories and I love the perspectives that you have here. I love the episode that you did with my friend, my great, wonderful, brilliant, genius Rolling Stone colleague, Annie Martosio. And you had her talking about Let It Be and, arguments I've had with her. It's just her amazing perspectives on the Beatles, which are so eye-opening for me always. But I feel like you are, passing the story of this music on as so many of us who love this music, we're just trying to do justice to it and to pass it on to other people who love it.
Oh, well, thank you, Rob. And, this conversation has been hands down the best and my favorite and the most in-depth conversation I think I've ever had about the Beatles, which I have to thank you for, because you and I can both literally talk about this for 24 hours or even more.
Me too. I'm just looking at the clock. I was like, I can't believe it's almost 3 hours
and that was the fastest 3 hours ever, honestly. But honestly, I want to thank you, Rob, because just thank you for everything that you do and everything that you contribute to music and music journalism and all of the takes you bring to the table.
Thank you for everything you do. Thank you. It's totally inspirational. I hope you do them for other artists you love and idolize, because but I guess part of also the Beatles thing is they teach us how to be fans of something. So people who become Beatles fans, they go on to become fans of something else, whether it's literature or baseball or environmental activism, whatever people are into. The Beatles teach us passion,
They really do.
And how to translate that into a long ongoing adult life. So,
and teach us how to make it influence every single thing you do for 1 year and then switch to something else.
Totally. I love also how and it's really funny, something I mentioned in the book, but it's always weird to me how the phrase primal scream, everybody in the English speaking world knows what that means. It's John was into that for 3 months, it's that's all primal scream. And we all know what a primal scream type of expression is. And it's
right.
It's just because John was into this thing for an entirely tiny period of time and forgot about it. But, but yeah, like you say, that they threw themselves wholeheartedly into all those things.
Yeah.
But also some things that turn out to be keepers, it's certainly like George, discovering religion the way he did. And overnight I've seen the light and I'm going to, and honestly, from my adult jaded perspective, I guess I would be yeah, that's going to last, 6 months or whatever. It's no, he stayed true to that and he passed it on.
Yeah.
Almost everybody in the English speaking world knows what transcendental meditation is. And it's mostly because of George Harrison. And, there's also, Ringo's out there talking about David Lynch and of course like the Maharishi himself and millions of other people who've like talked about TM and passed it on, and like people who are like continuing this practice around the world. Certainly don't mean to suggest that it's any kind of structure, but like
Right.
everybody knows what it means and we hear about it and what it's supposed to be doing. Like George Harrison is largely personally responsible for that. It's insane.
Oh, absolutely. And even with things as simple as picking up instruments. Like
Absolutely.
for me, I picked up the guitar because number one, I wanted to be like the Beatles, and number two, because songs expire. You've Got to Hide Your Love Away is only 2 minutes and 30 seconds long. I want to be in that song for 3 hours. So I pick
Yes.
up the guitar and I play it for 3 hours.
And I've been trying to figure it out for 50 years, you know, like
Yeah.
I'm still constantly hearing myself in those stories. Like, and that's, you know, and also I think, you know, like when I first heard that song, you know, it was the first time I saw Help and I was 5 years old. I know exactly how old I was. So I can very specifically place myself in the room where I was, the age I was when I heard that song the first time. I know for a fact I loved it the first time. And I'm like, what did I think it was about? I
Right.
like I know it processing all the adult emotion in that song. Like I was like, you know, what was it about that song that my 5-year-old self totally got? Because, you know,
Yeah.
that's a hard, and like I'm still, you know, like I'm still like, oh, now I finally get that song. You know, like in my 50s, I'm still figuring stuff like that out. It's like it's
Yeah.
mind blowing to me.
Just long days in kindergarten. You come home and you throw the briefcase or your lunchbox to the side, and you just sigh, throw on a Beatles record. It's something that humans can relate to no matter what age, because you always feel like that, I think.
Yeah, and these songs carry with you through, you know, through your whole life, like, and they change on you. So like some songs, like Penny Lane, another good example. That was a song I loved when I was a little boy, and then when I was a teenager, I thought like, yeah, this is a, you know, pretty technically accomplished, but kind of slick and ultimately like lightweight Paul McCartney confection. And that's like kind of how I heard it in my 20s and my 30s. And then like at some point, and I did not make this conscious decision, and I was like, Penny Lane, what a song! There's so much going
Yeah.
on in that song. And
Yeah.
I was like, and also musically, like I heard, so I was like, oh, okay, like he's taking Pet Sounds even deeper than Brian Wilson could musically, like, and you know, like, and I was like, I see why entire great bands base their entire careers, you know, like on this one song. You know, like the Zombies were just trying to do this song forever, and they got
Right.
genius out of that. And
Yeah.
I feel like with, you know, Penny Lane, that's a song also that I appreciate now, and the different kind of like dialogue between the characters. And I'm like, you know, as a little kid, I know I love this song, and like there was just a lot going on in the song that I was just too little to know. And it's like really funny that when I was 17, I thought I was too cold, too worldly for that song, too cool and
Right.
sophisticated for that song. I was like, wow, when I was 17, I knew nothing about what was going on in that song. I'm like,
Yeah.
oh, Penny Lane, that's the bus station where he would wait for the bus that would take him to John's house. And like, and also like he's doing this song knowing that it was a mile from like where John grew up. Like, and he's doing this song after hearing John sing about Strawberry Fields. And these are all like behind the scenes stuff that like kind of like enhances the song, but also just like hearing it is like, oh, this is this song about this like, you know, adult guy who's world famous, acclaimed, super can go anywhere he wants. All doors are open to him. And he's thinking about this tiny little place that he dreamed of escaping when he was a kid. And like now he's daydreaming about it. And what does it mean to go back there and see it with his adult eyes? And he's kind of walking himself. And, you know, I've never done the Liverpool tourist tour, so I've never actually been to Penny Lane. I want to someday, but like it's funny that it's something that, you know, it's something that we just know it from him going back and seeing it through the nurse's eyes. And you know, I was an adult before I really noticed the nurse in this song, and I was like, well, this isn't the nurse in this song. This isn't a character that Bob Dylan would sing about, and not a
Yeah.
character that Mick Jagger would sing about, or Ray Davies is really the closest you could come. Like, but you know that this nurse, she's at her job, she's, you know, doing her duty, she's passing up poppies from a tray, and she's like picturing this like cool play that she's in as she walks through her day, and you know she's daydreaming. And this is, you know, uh, and this is, you know, this just it's not how like it's not how boys sang about girls at the time, but also like
Yeah.
it's just it teaches Paul something about his own life to imagine it through this woman's eyes. And of
Yeah.
course, like again, we know, like, okay, his mother was a nurse, and like she probably did some selling poppies from a tray, if that's something nurses did. I don't even know what that means. Like, I haven't researched that weird habit of British hospital life if it was. But in terms of like, his nurse, and like the way that, that the Beatles' mothers keep showing up in their songs in fascinating ways. But, we take these songs with us through our lives, and the songs change with us, and they're, an ongoing dialogue that we have with ourselves as well as with the Beatles.
I just had David Wilde on.
I love that guy. I love David Wilde.
He's great. He's such a great guy. And he was telling me this story about how he wrote a story for the 2014 Grammy Salute to the Beatles. And the story was about why Paul McCartney wrote the song Let It Be. And David cited it was because the Beatles were breaking up and Paul was looking to his mother for inspiration. And David never got that story cleared by Paul himself. So as John Legend was saying that story in front of the camera and in front of Paul McCartney, and the whole thing was live, David was like, "Oh, I never got approval for that story."
Wow.
But it turns out, Paul was smiling and nodding, and it turned out to be true.
Wow.
But, these songs kind of serve as journals for Paul and Ringo now, and they can look back on their 20s and say, that's what I was thinking back then when I wrote that.
Absolutely. Like hearing the White Album outtake version of that, where he thinks he's going to to pitch it to Aretha Franklin, and he's singing like Brother Malcolm comes to me, Brother Martin comes to me, and it's like, wow, like that was going into the song as well. And to think about these songs that these other singers around the world heard something in, something that I just recently like write this song on their couch because they're just catatonic and they can't move, and they actually go into a studio and record it so it's 6 minutes long, and the radio plays it with a completely ridiculous trombone solo. Everything about that song is bizarre. I find it insane that it exists. I found that song irritating for a long time, and then I came to find it very amusing and endearing. But like, I heard Billy Paul sing that song, and I was like, my God, like he made it a totally beautiful, soulful, meaningful, political, like a personal, intense song. And I was like, not even Paul could have heard it that way. Like he did this with, the most trivial and fluffy of Paul songs. He made it something like absolutely soulful and heroic. And I love that, like, perfect example of like people hearing things in this music that makes them like tell their own story.
There was also this really cool moment from the Get Back documentary where the Beatles are recording this song with Billy Preston, and John starts reciting the I Have a Dream speech by Martin Luther King Jr. In place of lyrics.
I love that.
And I think it shows that they were very in tune with civil rights, and all of that was part of their consciousness at that time. But I forget what song it was, though.
It's weird because, like, oh, it's I Want You, She's So Heavy.
Oh, that's right.
And there's what's weird because they do that in like I've Got a Feeling and Don't Let Me Down. They sing the I Have a Dream. It's weird how much they talk about the I Have Dream speech in Get Back. Like they're talking about Martin Luther King specifically. Like there's the version they're doing with Billy Preston on the first day of Don't Let Me Down, and like John is doing that speech while Billy Preston plays the organ. And then they're doing that like I Want You, like, and they're doing the I Have a Dream speech, like as they're just making up I Want You, She's So Heavy.
Right.
And it's wild that like these songs that, that they certainly like, that they definitely like, they were inspired by the world beyond Liverpool. and like, but they couldn't in their wildest dreams have imagined how the whole world would hear those songs and translate those stories into those songs, so that everything they heard, like with like Paul writing Blackbird because he was inspired by the civil rights struggle in the U.S. and that
Mhm.
like a black artist like Sylvester, thousands of miles away, hears Blackbird and like decides it's a story about the queer black American coming out like in San Francisco in the 70s. And it's like it's wild that like the Beatles dialogue with the whole world that played into these songs, whether it was show tunes or bossa nova or R&B or gospel or the blues or skiffle or whatever, that it was a
Yeah.
two-way dialogue all the time, that all these people
Yeah.
like kept hearing their stories in the Beatles. Aretha Franklin singing "The Long and Winding Road" is like maybe the most I've been surprised by hearing a cover version of a Beatles song. That like
Yeah.
I thought that song, I just hated that song. I just thought
Really?
like yeah, I couldn't hear past the Goop, the Phil Spector Goop on top of it.
Yeah.
And it's wild how like hearing Angie Bartesio from Rolling Stone talk about that song. I was like, wow, like I feel like I was an idiot missing that song like for all those years. She hears
Right.
so much in it that's absolutely there.
Yeah.
But it's funny that it was a song that I totally dismissed, and I heard Aretha Franklin sing it, and I was like, oh wow, she and Paul are so on the same wavelength that I felt so embarrassed that I hadn't heard any of that pain in the song. And
Yeah.
Aretha's like, yep, like, don't leave me standing here. I'm still outside your door. Song
Yeah.
ends. I haven't gone through the door yet. I'm still waiting. And it's very much like Billy Paul singing is, someone's knocking at the door, somebody's ringing the bell, open the door and let him in. And it's like, like, these, black artists who are coming from this world that certainly inspired the Beatles, but they added their own stories to that using the Beatles music. And, it was a two-way dialogue between like all these different musical worlds and all these different musical cultures, and it's just like it's really amazing to see that happen.
And another great example of that is when the Beatles are performing "Hey Jude" on, I believe, the David Frost show in 1968, and Paul just starts interpolating "The Weight" by the band and saying, "Take a load off Annie."
So beautiful. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's really beautiful. And I guess that's what I mean by them being so open. So that's why I'm totally on board with your Star Wars theory that like
Yeah.
John would have been like, okay, what's going on? All right, we're gonna do this, like, and
Yeah.
we absolutely would have had, like they would have had Raiders of the Lost Ark, or like they would have redone every 80s movie franchise. They would have like
Yeah.
hopped onto every trend. I really feel like they would have made a great, like late 80s Detroit techno album with, Kevin Saunderson and Derek May and Juan Atkins. I feel like that would have been a great Beatle project that absolutely would have happened because they could do all these things that,
Yeah. Absolutely. I think John would have even ventured into producing rap in the 90s, just sampling. I would think he would have loved sampling.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, he totally would. He said, wow, I wish that this existed back when I was getting sued by, the Genovese family over like stealing from Chuck Berry songs.
Yeah.
It's like, I take one line and I'm in court for years, like,
Right. And I have to do the whole rock and roll album
yes,
too.
exactly. Like, because I signed the stupidest legal settlement in the history of rock star lawsuits.
Yeah.
Like, just like the whole like like that they would have been so fascinated by all these worlds, and that like lots of rock stars did their own terrible versions of these, like certainly like everybody remembers when like, Lou Reed did a rap song, like there's like,
Yeah.
I guess we all remember when Paul McCartney kind of did a rap song that we'll just let that pass. There's no need to mention that title here. But I feel like competing with each other, they would have been forced to, to really open up to the world that was, grooving on their music just as they were grooving on the world's music, and this dialogue would have kept going. But I feel like it's kept going after the Beatles stopped, and it'll keep going like after they're all gone, and it'll keep going after we're all gone. Musicians, but also other artists will still be hearing the Beatles and saying like, "Yep, that's telling me to go out there and tell my story."
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's honestly the perfect way to sum up the Beatles. They're storytellers, they're time capsules, and they are the essence of music in the past, present, and future. And they always will be.
Absolutely. It's no exaggeration. It's crazy, but like, yeah, it's no exaggeration.
Well, Rob, thank you so much for coming on the show. I honestly cannot even begin to tell you how much I enjoyed that conversation.
Oh my God, that was so, so, so fun. Yeah, I was like, clearly like we could have talked all night. Like it was so funny because like ever since I've been listening to your podcast, I've been like, like wanting to like, like talk about this stuff with you. And this was like even more fun than I imagined.
Well, I'll have to have you back on sometime and we can dive deeper into solo albums and single songs. And
But I'm such a fan of like well, everything you do, like on Twitter. Like honestly, like, you're one of like 3 reasons that I like actively look forward to checking that site. Like,
oh, thank you, Rob. That means a lot to me. Thank
there's
you.
very little else that's pleasant that's going on there. But just with the podcast and that, like, just thank you for everything you do.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Here, There, and Everywhere podcast. Thank you, Rob, for coming on. Everybody, be sure to go follow Rob on Twitter @RobChef and check out his book, Dreaming the Beatles. Follow us on Twitter @BeatlesEarth. Check us out at BeatlesEarth.com and follow this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Tune in next week for another very special guest.